Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Hello. It's so nice to see a packed room. I'm so glad that you are all here. I want to welcome you all to WOSU-NPR Studios. I want to welcome you all who are here in person, which is so great to see. I'm giddy. Thank you so much for coming. And of course, the folks who are watching virtually via our live stream, I want to welcome them as well for our official World Food Day 2022 programming. My name is Danny Nierenberg, and I am the co-founder with Bernard Pollock of Food Tank. We are a research and advocacy organization really dedicated to telling stories of hope and success in food and agriculture systems, both internationally and domestically. And we do that to inspire, motivate, and activate positive food system change. I am so honored to be able to begin our event with two inspiring videos. First, we will hear from Dr. Cristina M. Johnson, the president of Ohio State University, who has welcome remarks to share. And then we'll watch a video greeting from U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown.
Hello, I'm Cristina Johnson, president of The Ohio State University, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the North American site of the United Nations World Food Day, hosted by our John Glenn College of Public Affairs, College of Medicine, College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences, the Ohio State Dining Services, and WOSU Public Media in partnership with Food Tank, the Ohio Food Policy Network, the United Nations Environment Program, and the UN Food and Agriculture Program of North America. Thank you all so much for your hard work and for making this event possible. And thank you to all our guests who are attending in person and tuning in from around the world. Ohio State takes its role in the global movement to end hunger, malnutrition, and food insecurity seriously. Due to several factors in recent years, most notably the COVID-19 pandemic, the world's momentum here has gone off track. It's time to course correct. In 2021, as many as 828 million people worldwide were impacted by hunger and food insecurity. That is nearly 2.5 times the population of the United States. And there are about 2.4 million critically food insecure people in the United States who may not eat today. It is also an issue on our nation's college campuses. Close to 50% of our students are affected by food insecurity. Even one person going hungry is too much. We know that in order to get back on track, it requires providing resources, access, planning for the future, and working together to make change happen broadly and quickly. And creating positive change starts at home in the communities we serve. Ohio State is dedicated to addressing these challenges.
Is that Scope 2 or Scope 3 emissions?
For example, one of my top priorities as president is to set Ohio State on a challenging yet necessary goal to become a net zero carbon university as soon as possible to combat the climate crisis, which directly affects access to and availability of nutritious food. Our College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences is a cornerstone of our university's land-grant mission because its goal is to sustain life. The college connects with local communities to provide resources for local needs in all of Ohio's 88 counties. A team of Ohio State researchers at the College of Medicine, in partnership with collaborators at community-based organizations, recently received a 5-year, multi-million-dollar grant from the National Institutes of Health to address type 2 diabetes and food insecurity. Our Ohio State students also take active roles in this effort. The student-led Buckeye Food Alliance works to reduce the impacts of food insecurity through outreach efforts and the operation of a client choice food pantry, which provides fresh produce, pantry staples, meat and dairy products, personal care items, and more. And there are two faculty members who deserve special recognition, Dr. Jill Clark and Dr. Rattan. Dr. Clark is an associate professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs and earned a 2022 Excellence in Faculty Community Engagement Award from the Engagement Scholarship Consortium for her amazing leadership with the Franklin County Local Food Council. And Dr. Lal is the Distinguished University Professor of Soil Science and the founding director of the Carbon Management and Sequestration Center in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. His research spans over 5 decades and 6 continents. He was awarded the 2020 World Food Prize for developing and mainstreaming a soil-centric approach to increasing food production that restores and conserves national resources and mitigates climate change. We've made great progress, but we can and will continue to do much more with your help. I wish you all the best for a successful event filled with important discussions and plans for the future. Thank you.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's an honor to serve the great state of Ohio in the United States Senate. Thanks to the Ohio Food Policy Network, the Ohio State University, the John Glenn College of Public Affairs for hosting this event. Thanks for all that the public spiritedness and activism of all of you. I'm glad that World Food Day is being celebrated in Columbus. I can't think of a better place to hold this event than in Ohio, where 1 in 7 depend on food and agriculture for their jobs in our state. Over the last few decades, we've seen our food supply chain stretch too long and too thin. Everyone sees the problems with rising prices, particularly at the grocery store. Family farms are forced to compete with large-scale farming operations that frankly don't pay their workers enough. They cut corners and they take far more than their fair share of profits. We know one of the major reasons for inflation is what the big food conglomerates and the meat packers did during the pandemic to raise their prices. That's something we're working to change. It's going to be a big focus of the next farm bill. Writing a farm bill every 5 years is one of the most important things we do on the Senate Agriculture Committee. It's something we almost always do in a bipartisan way. I'm proud to be the only Ohioan serving on the Senate Agriculture Committee in the last almost 60 years. I've been around the state the past few months. I hear from farmers about what support they need in the new farm bill. I'll keep doing that with local farmers and food banks and families. And I want all of you to keep calling on me. Let me know what your priorities are and what you need and what you think. My goal is the same as it's been with every farm bill every 5 years, to fight for a more just and equitable food and farming system where every farmer, every worker, every consumer is treated with dignity. Every year in about March or April, I ask 6 of my colleagues, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, to join me on the Senate floor, and we read together, one after another, from a letter from the Birmingham jail that Dr. King sent in 1963. Most of you have probably read that, maybe back in school. It's not a bad idea to read it again, but I bring people to the floor to read this letter because, as you may remember, Dr. King, the moderate white ministers in Alabama were saying, Dr. King, go slow, be patient. We're going to get there on voting rights. And Dr. King had it with being patient. And I always save one of the center parts of the letter that I get to read when we divide it into 7. The line that Dr. King uses when he said, progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It rolls in because of advocates and community members like you who work to make a difference, who work to keep local farms connected to their communities, who help Ohio families put food on the table every day, every night. Thank you for your involvement in all of that and making Ohio a better place to live.
I want to thank Dr. Johnson and Senator Brown for those inspiring words. And Senator Brown is right. There's a real urgency, and I hope that you hear that throughout the day. There's a lot of action taking place, but there is a real urgency to act on food and agriculture issues right now. And as Dr. Johnson said, we are so excited to be here in Columbus in partnership with Ohio State University, the Ohio Food Policy Network, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations North America, and to be hosted by WOSU, a national public radio affiliate, for the official North American World Food Day 2022 celebration. This year's theme is very important. It is Leave No One Behind, Better Production, Better Nutrition, a Better Environment, and a Better Life. And this is really a set of themes that speaks to the goals that we all share. Building food and agriculture systems that are more inclusive, more regenerative, and more nourishing. And that's the goal of so many of the speakers that we have brought together today. And so many of you in the audience are working toward those goals as well. We need to highlight and celebrate the communities, organizations, farmers, policymakers, business leaders, and others who are striving to transform our food and agriculture systems. And it gives us an opportunity to see how food and agriculture can be the solution to some of our most pressing environmental and social problems. This is a particularly significant year for food and agriculture. As many of you know, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27, will take place in Egypt in November. And for the first time ever, the conference will feature multiple pavilions dedicated to food and agriculture. This represents a real shift away from the way that global leaders have viewed food and agriculture at the climate change conference in the past. So now there is real momentum, and now is our time to capitalize on it. And while there is much to celebrate on World Food Day, there is way too much to do. We need more accessible, affordable, and equitable food systems that are diverse and inclusive and include youth and women and transgender folks and address inherent misogyny and racism in our food systems. Whether we're talking about climate, biodiversity, food loss and waste, poverty, education, gender, economic policy, the food system is really the through line through all of these issues. And it's beyond time for those in power to realize it. I hope that everyone today will participate very actively in today's discussions by sharing your thoughts via social media with the hashtag World Food Day. I'll say that again, hashtag World Food Day. We will repost your comments throughout the day. For this World Food Day, we have co-produced with the amazing partners that I've already mentioned an incredible agenda of 20+ speakers who are from across Ohio and across the country. The speakers will be led in conversation by Ohio's top journalists. These discussions will be fast, dynamic, and thought-provoking. We think this format, and it's a format that Food Tank tries to use as much as possible, allows for honest, blunt, and really uncomfortable conversations. I believe we all have to be more uncomfortable when we're talking about these issues because it helps us find the solutions that we need. And for those who are here in person, please do not leave early. OSU Dining Services has done something really special for us and created a really incredible reception that will start promptly at 5 p.m. because we will end on time. And you will all have a chance to personally meet today's speakers. So I'm really excited now to welcome somebody who I really admire, and that's Michelle Moskowitz-Brown, the chair of the Ohio Food Policy Network. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here in this great new community resource. As Danny said, I'm the chair of the Ohio Food Policy Network and the executive director at Local Matters, where we focus on food education, access, and advocacy. And the Ohio Food Policy Network has existed in some form for about 15 years. And we support coordination, communication, and collaboration amongst all food system stakeholders with a vision to transform our food policy and food environment. So we are all volunteer run. We have many of our steering committee members in the room, and that might change at some point, but the commitment from all of these members has been incredible for so many years. So thank you to the OFPN steering committee. But all of you are OFPN. If you live in the state of Ohio, or if you're visiting us, you can still come back and join us at a variety of times. But you could also consider joining our steering committee. We're about to open up some seats, so look out for that in the follow-up to the whole conference. And we hope that if there's a desire on your part to get more involved, that you will join us and help us steer the food system to be more equitable, resilient, accessible, healthful, and sustainable. But as we consider the policies we need to get us there, as Danny was talking about, I hope that we'll continue to learn and grow from the past and current realities of oppression in our country, acknowledging that our fates are all tied together. So I encourage us also to be future thinking. I mean, we talked a little bit already about urgency and, problems don't solve themselves, as Senator Brown was sharing, but also we need to think out a little bit. If you were at our lunch, we did a little activity. We looked at sort of facts around the food system, current facts like school food is terrible. And then we imagined, what if in 10 years you flip that fact and school food is, fresh and enjoyable and delicious. So I think that as you listen today, maybe you're hearing about problems in the food system. Think about, what if we flip this? Like 10 years is enough time for us to think about what would change really look like. And this comes from Jane McGonigal, an activity, janemcgonigal.com. And let's see, I have the rest of that here somewhere. The future, Yeah, the Institute for the Future is her other her project. So want to encourage you to do that. And then once you do that, like let's say you want to look at the future of school food, you can Google that and kind of see the change is already there. It's just not evenly distributed, right? That's what we're all here thinking and learning about. So what are those signals? And maybe every week you look for a few more signals. So 100 facts on a topic and then flip it and see what you find. So I'd be happy to see if you want to put it in the chat as well if you're online. So we could all vision what that looks like, because we're all so busy and we're all trying to do everything we can, but also looking out to the future can have some great effect. I wanted to do some special thanks. I already mentioned the steering committee, but also Jill Clark, Amy Velasquez, Elaine McLaughlin, Overholt, Liz Stites, Carol Smathers, and Rick Livingston for their special work on this summit. We usually do an annual summit with the OFPN, and sort of this special event has taken the place of that, but we hope that you'll join us next year as well. And then you can find us at ohiofpn.org. So please sign up for the listserv, and if there's anything that stands in your way from getting more involved, if it's you just want to call and chat, I'm happy to do that, and look forward to seeing you all at an event again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to acknowledge that there are really powerful women who have helped organize this event, including Dr. Johnson, and now I get to introduce Jill Clark, who I want to give her a round of applause before she comes on stage for the award she won this year. So Jill is the Associate Professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, so please welcome her again with applause.
Thank you. So Senator John Glenn once said, if there's one thing I've learned in my years on this planet, it's that the happiest and most fulfilled people I've known are the ones who've devoted themselves to something bigger and more profound than merely their own self-interest. And this room and online, to be filled with so many such people who are working to improve the food system for the sake of society is just fitting to the senator's memory. But to the purpose of me being at this podium, the following was written by the Newark Earthworks Center at OSU, and so I thank them for their words. OSU has no university-wide land acknowledgement, so until then we offer this. This event is taking place on lands that were home to indigenous people for thousands of years, including the ancestors who built the incredible earthworks and mounds throughout what is now Ohio, and as well as their descendants, the tribes who were here at the time of the arrival of non-natives, the Delaware, the Miami, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Seneca, Shawnee, and Wyandot tribes, along with more than 30 other tribes. We also recognize the tribes whose land was taken, often through brute force, coercion, trickery, and or lopsided treaties, and then sold to raise money that contributed to OSU's founding endowment. Our university benefited from land taken from no less than 108 tribes and bands who are located as close as Michigan, but as far as California. In addition to recognizing these past wrongdoings, our event today asks those gathered here to acknowledge the present harm that continues to be visited upon tribal land and governments, and against American Indian peoples, and support their rights to sovereignty and self-determination and an equal opportunity for life, liberty, and happiness, and ask how we might address these individually and also through the organizations and institutions that you are affiliated with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. And a reminder to everyone to use the hashtag World Food Day. These issues need to be discussed, and they, as while they might be uncomfortable, they need to be discussed online and very openly. So I am now excited to introduce our first conversation of the afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Marty Schladen with the Ohio Capital Journal, who will be speaking with one of my heroines, Jocelyn Brownhall of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm really honored to be here with you, Jocelyn, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
There's a lot of expertise in this room. I represent that element of the crowd that knows next to nothing. So why don't we start just with basic stuff? What is the history of World Food Day? What is FAO, and what's its history?
Okay. But before I start there, I have to say, go Guardians. I'm
Well,
from
you know
Cleveland.
oh,
We
yeah.
pulled it out of the hat last night. Nail biter, but we always do. It's such a, yeah, so go Guardians. So World Food Day. World Food Day is October 16th, so wish FAO a happy birthday. It's today. It was the day that we were founded in 1945 in Quebec, Canada. Food and Agriculture Organization is the oldest technical specialized agency of the United Nations, and it was conceived actually in 1943 in Hot Springs, Virginia, by countries such as the United States and Canada who recognized that global hunger was a problem that needed to be addressed on a global scale. So in 1945, Food and Agriculture Organization was consecrated in Montreal, Canada, and we are here with you today, 70 plus years later.
And 70 plus years later, we don't exactly have these problems licked. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the big issues that we're all facing, both globally and domestically?
Sure. Well, I'll do a couple of statistics that I think people should just have at their fingertips. One is we have almost 830 million people who are still food insecure, somewhere around 130 million to 140 million people who are acutely food insecure, meaning they're definitely not getting enough calories and they may not make it. We have over 3 billion people who do not have access to healthy diets, 3 billion people who don't have access to clean water. So there's some points right there. We have an global agricultural system that is both a contributor to and casualty of climate change. And we have here in the United States alone, according to the U.S. EPA, agriculture contributes to about 11% of the greenhouse gases. So we have a lot of challenges ahead, and that's kind of why we every year talk about World Food Day, because, as you said, we haven't cracked the code yet.
And these kinds of problems are so big, they can be really daunting, and I find that people have a tendency to tune out because they feel like there's just nothing can be done, so I'll just have another drink or whatever. But when we talked earlier, you brought up some really hopeful things. For example, we've got a lot of people immigrating to the United States out of desperation. But say in Guatemala, there are some things you can do that you guys are doing to keep people there. Why don't you describe that?
Sure. So in case you didn't know, many developing countries where immigration is high, they're agrarian societies, right? So people are, the greatest percentage of the population is working in agriculture, even though it's maybe underproductive sector, but that's where people are coming from and that's what their livelihoods are. So our premise, and it's research that has been verified, is that if we help people stay where they are and have people, as Senator Brown talked about, have productive livelihoods in the rural sector, then we can keep them there. That's where they want to be. That's where they're from, and not making desperate choices and doing desperate things to emigrate to places where they think that there's more economic possibilities. So in the Food and Agriculture Organization, we do a lot of work around decent rural livelihoods is the term that we use to help farmers understand what practices that they're doing that are going to enhance their production and their livelihoods, those that may need to be changed. There's often too much fertilizer use or poor seed quality or not too much irrigation, too little of the right kinds of drip irrigation, trying to do it in a climate smart way, but also to teach them nutrition practices and food safety practices, but also to get the developed community to understand how important agriculture is to the migration issue, to a national security issue. And so many times agriculture is forgotten at the table.
And you said that these are relatively cheap things to do, to address. I forget what dollar figure you put on it. Could you remind me?
Well, so I'll give you a couple of little tidbits here. In Afghanistan, which is a country where wheat is the staple crop, we can feed a family of 7 on about $160 for about 7 months with what we call a wheat seed package, some seeds, a little bit of fertilizer, maybe a small ruminant, a goat, sheep, maybe a little drip irrigation technology, a hose. We can feed them for about $150, whereas actually feeding them directly, that same wheat, can be 3, 4, or 5 times that cost. So it's actually cheaper to teach them, or not to teach them, it's cheaper to support them in the livelihood that they already have than actually flying food in across the border.
Sort of the, teach them to fish.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets a little overused, but
So of course I used it.
But it's but we still haven't, even though it's a cliche, we still don't, we haven't absorbed it. We don't live that. So I'll give you another statistic. People, when the war in Ukraine occurred in late February, for the first time since World War II, we had 2 major agriculture producers fighting against one another, right? So we have Russia, major agriculture producer, Ukraine, huge wheat producer, especially for North America, the Middle East. And obviously, there's a lot of issues around food availability and what was going to happen. And someone asked me, what was the single most, if I could fund one thing, what would I do? And I said, well, I would really like $30 million to fill out our soil maps at FAO. Dr. Lal is in the crowd here. He's actually, I'm a huge fan of his. I saw him get his prize last year, so that was very cool at the World Food Prize. But we have soil maps that are 60 years old, and they're not digitized, or countries have changed in the last 60 years, right? We had the Soviet Union 60 years ago, and we don't have that today. Countries have changed names. We have zero updated information. $30 million, and we could upgrade our entire soil, not entire, we could do a major push on our soil mapping data. That's, in the grand scheme of fighter jets and, other kinds of interventions, even direct feeding assistance interventions, $30 million is a paltry sum.
That's incredibly disturbing. I didn't know that we hadn't updated those.
That's national data that countries are supposed to do on their own, and countries generally or oftentimes put things like agriculture census, soil data far down the list. And so we in FAO would like to upgrade that. We're very grateful. The United States government gave us $20 million. So we're going to be able to upgrade a lot, but we're not going to be able to do the whole world. So
let's talk a little bit about things that people can do in this room. One thing we talked about earlier is, this is a room full of voters. So for example, if somebody's getting ready to vote or talking to somebody who's asking for their vote in federal office, you could ask them, what do you know about these soil maps and what will you do to update them, right?
Yeah, you could. I mean, Senator Brown talked about the Farm Bill coming up, right?
Yep.
That is the United States food and agriculture policy for the next 5 years. So, understanding what's in that policy, who gets what out of that? There have been some amazing changes in farm bills over time that have happened. We have the Conservation Reserve Program that's come out of the Farm Bill. There's been changes to the subsidies program. You can actually ask your representative, what's in the Farm Bill? What are you doing about having sustainable food systems? And that's something that's important to me as a voter, and I want you to tell me what you're going to do about that.
So where would I go? I mean, because the Farm Bill, I'm sure, is thousands of pages of really turgid copy.
Yeah, it is.
Where do you go to find out what it really says and, what it needs to have?
Well, we also have a former Secretary of Agriculture in here, so I might punt it to him instead. Secretary Glickman used to be my boss. USDA.gov, your representative. You could ask your representative, hey, tell me in layman's terms, what do you want to say? USDA.gov is a great place to go as well. And talk to your local farmer. The local farmer does get oftentimes get support in some ways. Go to every county has an extension agent. You could talk to your extension agent. There's a vast amount of resources here in the great Ohio State University. I'm sure there's some people wandering around in the College of Food and Agriculture who know a little bit about the Farm Bill. So I would also say it's not just at the federal level, it's at the local level. So we were talking beforehand about composting. If I could say, if you could do one thing, be compost your food, which I realize is not it's not a silver bullet, but it's a step in the right direction. And people are saying, well, what do you do about it? So, for example, my daughter goes to school in Louisiana, and she has to walk her compost. It's about a 25-minute walk, but she walks her compost to the compost. There's one lady in New Orleans who apparently takes composting. I'm lucky enough that I live in D.C., where every Sunday we have a compost drop-off due to the District of Columbia municipal government. Well, go up to your council person or your elder person, whatever alderman equivalent, and say, why don't we have a composting option? Why aren't there composts here on an Ohio State University campus? It's not that hard. It does cost money. It's not free, but nothing in life is free, and it's what you choose to spend your money on.
And so composting is, when we first talked, I thought you were saying I needed to compost my own stuff, but I live in the middle of the city. You're saying that municipal governments have a role to play here.
I think so. I think that food and agriculture security, food security, agriculture policy, and nutrition security are national security, and therefore part of every government's responsibility towards its citizenry.
So what other, shopping habits, other habits in people's day-to-day lives can they do to feel like they're helping?
Oh, it ranges a gamut, right? I mean, you can, there's a lot of people who want to, buy locally, which I think is admirable. I don't think it's completely accessible to a lot of people. I know myself, I have a 9-to-5 job. I have health insurance. I go to the farmer's market and I see strawberries for $6 a pint, where I can go to Safeway and get it for $3.95. I'm going to Safeway, and that's somebody who has a salaried income. So I think that there are some challenges there. We still haven't kind of cracked the code for farmers markets to be accessible to all types of people. There's obviously initiatives happening around the United States in terms of food banks, in terms of collecting food. We had a food hero last year who was collecting food that, kind of misfit food that didn't look as great as it could. I think we have to get away from wanting our apples and bananas to look perfect, like they're out of a painting, and understand that we're about to eat them, so it doesn't really matter what they look like. So there's that option again, sort of broadening our own or changing our mindset about what good food is. And I think that, there's other things that don't have to do necessarily with the food sector, but you as an individual can do. I mean, plastics are a major pollutant in our soil and our water. And yet we're still not addressing plastic pollution. It's cheaper to recycle aluminum than it is to mine it. So buy as much as you can in aluminum cans. Make that choice. That's what I do. So, I think there's little changes that you can make. So.
And another thing I need to say, because we just had this amazing lunch and I heard some really smart stuff, but another thing you can do is volunteer at your food banks. I'm told that they need them very much, so that's a thing you can do as well. They're seeing more business now than they even were during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
So here's something we talked about before. I want to make sure I understood you. You were saying that genetically modified foods, that's just science. And is that right?
Yeah. I mean, that's what the scientists tell me. I have an MBA in international development. I'm not a scientist myself, but I've worked in agriculture for 27 plus years with a lot of scientists at the Agricultural Research Service and throughout the land-grant university system. And certainly genetically modified organisms, or we call them, in the parlance of America, oftentimes we call them biotech. They're scientifically modified. They're modified. It's the same science that is used in the healthcare industry that is used in the agricultural industry. And there's proven studies that they are safe. I think where people run into trouble is the ways in which biotech could be applied. I mean, there's issues around profitability in major corporations. There's issues around, what wages are for people who are maybe harvesting. That's separate from the pure science of the biotech seeds. Now, I will say, it looks like the gene editing and the CRISPR approach, which is, you can turn on and off genes. I'm sure there's people in this who know more about it than I do, is probably going to leapfrog over this. And we're going to be in a situation where, our whole agricultural industry will be able to, we'll find that exact gene that we have to silence or turn on to make it more drought resistant, or make it more salt resistant, or have it grow more, or make it this disease resistant to this disease, or whatever. If any of you has had a vaccine to COVID and had your recent bivalent vaccine, which I had a week and a half ago, that is the exact same technology. So if you're willing to shoot it in your arm to stop you from getting from COVID, you should be willing to put it in your mouth, or you should be able to. You should be willing to let it be put into a cow's mouth or a pig's mouth that then gets, slaughtered and put into the food stream. I mean, the grocery store.
And this is technology that enables us to adapt to a rapidly changing environment.
Absolutely. The conventional technologies, which are still widely used around the world, can get us there. It just takes a lot longer. And one thing we don't have, and we know with climate change, we don't have time. So it's a question of, are you going to race against the clock? Are you going to hold back technology and science for, I would say, unproven science reasons? Because there's sort of you have some sort of question or ethical question around it, or are you going to allow that science and technology to keep pace with what's happening in climate change?
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I thought maybe we ought to talk about something that I just learned is of a much greater scope than I thought, and that's food waste.
It's a huge problem, and I should have started with my opening that we produce 1.5 times the amount of food in the world right now than we need. Then we produce more than 50% of the food that would feed the entire population right now, right? But we still have 830 million people who are hungry, right? And 3 billion people without access to healthy food. So we've clearly got a systems problem. And in the United States and Canada, which is what my office covers, the food waste is the big problem, right? The food loss is a problem, but not as much. There's a lot more regenerative food, and you'll talk to farmers about reusing food or sending it other places to, be for animal feed or other ways of getting rid of the food. But the food loss through restaurants, through universities, through airplanes, through the travel industry, airports, just enormous amount of food loss. And I think that really needs some attention about how, what are we going to do to address that as a society? What's going to be acceptable to us? Are we going to still accept that food is just going to be thrown away? Or are we going to, as a society, bring in some greater points? Because actually the second largest greenhouse gas emitter in the United States is food waste from landfills. So
which I just learned is a third of everything that's in a landfill.
Yes, exactly.
Any smart policy ideas, or is it just awareness raising that can be done?
Well, in the United Nations, we try to advise and show what is out there and try to guide countries towards better policies. It's a little bit hard to guide the United States. They don't always listen, but I certainly think that there's certainly whether it's biochar that absorbs the greenhouse gas emissions in the landfill, or it's other municipal food banks or things like that. There are solutions out there. It's a question of ensuring that we invest in them and that people want them and raise a voice and vote for them.
Well, that's all of our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Go Guardians.
Another round of applause for them, please. They were great. And I'm so grateful to both Jocelyn and Marty because they brought up so many interesting things, the food loss and food waste angle, but especially the soil health and the need to regenerate our soils and have more focused policies and practices on soil health. So you'll hear a lot more about that from Dr. Lal later this afternoon. It is now my pleasure and real honor to invite my friend Marion Nestle, Dr. Marion Nestle, to the stage. Please give her a round of applause. I say a lot of people are my favorite people, but she is truly one of my favorite people in the entire world.
And I love hearing it.
And I also say she's impossible to introduce because she is. So I have to try every time and I have to read it. So Marion is the Paula Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Emerita at New York University, which she chaired from 1988 to 2003, and from which she officially retired in 2017. This woman has not retired, let me tell you. She is the author of numerous books, including Food Politics, How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health, and of course her new memoir that just came out a few days ago, and I forgot to bring with me, which is called Slow Cooked, An Unexpected Life in Food Politics. And so we'll talk about that more in a little while. Marion, it's always fun to sit down with you. We've been doing this for a couple weeks now.
We've gotten good at it.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk to you.
So one of the things when we spoke this morning, we wanted to talk about World Food Day because, again, it is World Food Day. And Jocelyn said something that, she's the head of FAO North America, and she said food and agriculture are not often at the table at some of these big policy discussions, and that hurts my soul.
Yeah, food is not at the table. I remember when we started our food studies programs at New York University in 1996, the first question we got was, what's food studies and why would anybody want to study it? Which just leaves me breathless because some of the statistics that you heard, there's roughly 1 billion people in the world who are food insecure. There's several more billion who are slightly less food insecure. And then if you look at the other side of the coin, and at diet-related diseases, half the world's population is overweight or obese, and in the United States, 3/4 of American adults are overweight or obese, and therefore at risk of all the different chronic diseases, are at risk of bad outcome from COVID-19. And then we have the whole agriculture problem. So there are the three big public health issues related to food are hunger, diet-related chronic disease, and climate change. And we need to change the agricultural system so that it supports food for everybody and supports healthier diets for everyone.
Well, and you bring up a really interesting point. Those are really interrelated problems. Climate, nutrition, diet-related diseases, these are all things, biodiversity loss, they're all interrelated.
Yeah, you can't separate them. And, this is the big buzzword in nutrition and food studies these days is food systems. And by food systems, it means everything that happens to a food from the minute it's produced, transported, sold, purchased, fixed, cooked, and wasted. All of those things are in that cycle, and you can't talk about one of them without talking about all of them at once. So one of the reasons I think that it's not talked about is complicated. Sure. It's really complicated. It's hard to parse that out. So, I'm particularly interested in the relationship between agricultural production systems and food choices. The things that we put into our bodies personally. And we have a food system in the United States that produces twice the number of calories that the population needs. So waste is built into the system. And most of our food system is aimed at feeding animals. It's feed for animals and fuel for automobiles. You want to ask me what the craziest thing in the world is? It's that 40% of our corn is grown for ethanol. I'm sorry if some of you are ethanol producers here. But from a nutrition standpoint, this makes no sense at all. So the real question is, how do we develop a food system that promotes public health? Food for people. How's that for a concept?
Absolutely, yes. Well, and it is food for people and that protects the planet. And that is the piece of this that we haven't figured out. And I think when we talked about the Farm Bill earlier, in the past, there hasn't been paid a lot of attention to how to make the Farm Bill actually work for people and the planet, and that we need to maybe change what it's called. And I'm sure Secretary Glickman can get into this later, but is it a food and farm bill? Is it a food bill? Do we completely revamp how we think about what the Farm Bill looks like?
Oh, I think we have to. I mean, it's mired in history, and what it is a collection of literally hundreds of programs, each one with its own collection of lobbyists to make sure that it doesn't get changed. Plus, 80% of the funding is for food assistance programs for the poor. What's that doing there? Well, I know what it's doing there. That's politics. But we wouldn't have the Farm Bill if we didn't have log rolling, so that rural and urban states will both vote for this. But it needs a complete overhaul. I wrote an article for Political a few years ago, a very short one, about a teaching experience I had where I made the mistake of thinking that I could teach the Farm Bill to master's students at NYU. Ooh, did I learn my lesson? The article that I wrote for Politico was "The Farm Bill drove me insane." It was all I could say is it was not a happy teaching experience because it's way too complicated. And actually, a lot of it was informed by a staffer for Sherrod Brown who had worked for Sherrod Brown for 8 years by then and knew a lot about the Farm Bill because she said she had spent the last 8 years in meetings with lobbyists. Just think about it. That's how it gets written. Right. So we need a complete rethinking of our food system and a complete rethinking of the legislation that governs it. How we're going to get that is a challenge for all of us.
Absolutely. And, your life has been spent sort of making sure that all of us understand that food and politics are intimately linked. But when we're talking about Farm Bill and legislation, we need the politics out of food. We need the lobbyists to keep quiet so that real change can happen.
Yes, and we need advocates to be paid. I mean, which is the big problem with food advocacy. There are thousands of food advocacy organizations all across the country. We're seeing representation from the ones that are local. All of them are fighting for funding. Food companies sponsor and pay very handsome salaries to lobbyists to make sure that food companies get what they want, which is the ability to sell whatever products they're making a profit on. At the highest profit possible. That's what they're about. It's not that food companies are evil necessarily. It's that they're not social service agencies or public health agencies. They're businesses. And once you understand that agriculture is a business and food product companies are businesses, and they have stockholders to please, then a lot of what goes on in the food system is much more understandable.
Sure, absolutely. I wonder, Marion, if, I think we're sort of at this tipping point with food and agriculture. More and more people are interested. I talked about how at the United Nations Climate Change Conference there are going to be at least 4 pavilions around food. This is an extraordinary accomplishment made by advocacy groups pushing very hard for this, also by some corporations, I should say, to be very blunt. But how do we get to the next, how do we make sure that food is really a part of every conversation, that it's a part of decision-making practices at the local, national, and international levels? We see a lot happening, we talked about municipalities before. How do we make sure that food is really a part of what policymakers are thinking and what real people are thinking?
Well, I think it's eternal pushing. That was the significance of the White House conference that took place a few weeks ago, the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. And if it did anything, it was to bring national attention to some of these issues. For whatever, it's going to be interesting to see what, if anything, comes out of it. I can't say I'm wildly optimistic, but something good may come out of it. And it sure was fun to go to, I have to say.
We were excited to be there.
We were excited to be there. I, by the way, was invited late Sunday night for a meeting that started the following Wednesday. So,
But let's talk about it a little bit more. It was a historic event.
Absolutely.
It was 54 years in the making. The last one was during the
1969.
Yes.
A long time ago.
Right. During President Nixon's administration, which many good things came out of that conference. SNAP, our food stamps, WIC, Women, Infant, and Children program.
School lunches.
School lunches. So let's talk about what I heard a lot about at the White House conference was the need for universal school feeding.
Oh, let's just start with that, because during, if the pandemic did anything good, it was to focus attention on food system issues in a way that lots of people didn't understand them before, but they sure understand them now, because it was obvious that meatpacking workers were being forced to work. Grocery store workers were being forced to work. They were getting sick in droves. And all of a sudden, that whole issue of low-wage work in the food system became very obvious. The need for school meals. Oh, guess what? Kids aren't fed if they're not going to school. That became very obvious. And the Biden administration made school lunch universal, which many advocates have been pushing for decades.
Right.
It was thrilling when that happened, and now it's stopped.
Right.
How do we get it back? I think the only way to get it back is to scream. Talk to your legislators. Write your congressional representatives. Organize your communities. Kids should be fed in school. We shouldn't even be discussing it. And we certainly shouldn't be putting school personnel and teachers in the position of being policing who gets fed and who doesn't get fed in school.
Absolutely. Here. I wonder what your thoughts are on, we talked about the pandemic and, how it shined a spotlight on so many things, including the need for universal school lunches, the role of farm workers, which we'll hear about later, and processing plant workers. But now I feel like people have a very short memory. They've forgotten the things that we've learned during the pandemic. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, everybody is just trying to get by. The pandemic was pretty tough on people. I don't know. I only know one or two people who had an easy time of it. Most people had a really hard time with it, and we're all still recovering, some more quickly than others. So I think it's, people have to deal with their daily lives, and it's hard to look at big picture political issues, especially when political issues are so partisan these days. I mean, one of the things about the 1969 White House conference was you look at President Nixon's speeches about it, they bring tears to your eyes. We cannot live in a society where children are hungry, he said. I mean, you can't imagine a Republican president saying something like that now. So times have changed, and the real problem that we have in our society is to bring the partisan, to do something to fix the partisan divide. I can't think of a better way to do it than through food. The idea that food in schools has become a partisan issue is enough to make me cry. And how could this be? The idea that childhood obesity is a partisan issue is enough to make me cry. We should be doing everything that we can to feed children appropriately and tapping into everybody's concern about the future of our country. Children are the future of our country. We need to do something about our kids these days, and we need to do something about their schools. We need to do something about their food.
Right.
We need to do something about their health care. I could go on and on.
Marion, I have naively thought and said out loud for many years that food is our only nonpartisan issue. And I don't think that anymore. There are certain issues, that are nonpartisan or bipartisan. But, when you and I were together a few weeks ago at Expo East, which is one of the largest natural food conferences in the U.S. and certainly the world, it's a crowd of people who are already converted, let's say. And there was a lot brought up about regenerative agriculture and regenerative food systems. But what you have studied is how the food industry has taken over some of the words that those of us working on sustainability and food issues have used. First it was organic or natural, which means nothing. But now they're using these terms regenerative. And how can we make sure that consumers know that regenerative is being greenwashed as much as these other terms?
Well, it's greenwashing and health washing, and a group has just come out with a analytical report on the 11 largest processed food companies, looking at their actual actions as in terms of what they promised, and have found just shocking lack of attention to the promises. And I would say this should surprise nobody, because food companies are not social service agencies, they're not public health agencies. Their primary goal in life is to sell products and make returns, profits for stockholders. And once you understand that, the expectation that food companies are going to change their practices and produce healthy food and start supporting fruits and vegetables and grains and getting rid of junk food and making junk food in smaller portions, that's just not going to happen, because their stockholders will be very unhappy about it. And unhappy stockholders is not something that any corporation wants. So we need regulation. We need the government to step in. And here's where the bipartisan issues come in, and the partisanship makes it so difficult to get the government to step in and do what seems to me to be incredibly obvious, which is to just say, okay, we're going to have universal school meals. One of the things about universal school meals is it won't cost any more, because they won't have to do all that paperwork.
Absolutely.
They won't have to do all that administrative work. It just takes the administration out of it completely. And so not to do that makes no sense at all. And the only reason not to do it is because it's an election year and groups think that they can get votes this way.
Yeah, it's insanity to me. I do want to take a step back, because one of the reasons we wanted you at this particular event is that you've written many important books in your lifetime. But the latest one is Slow Cooked, your memoir. And you wrote it because of young people asking you how you became Marion Nestle.
Yes, a question that I never know how to answer. So the pandemic hit, and I needed a project to work on during the pandemic. And I usually write nonfiction books that require hours of research in libraries and looking at papers in my office. And of course, I couldn't get into my office and couldn't get into libraries. So I thought I'd tackle my first work of fiction and try to, memoirs are very different from biographies. They're about memory. That was the first thing I had beaten into me, was that memoirs are not biographies. They're about what you remember. And so I tried to specifically address the questions that I'm always asked. How did I get interested in food? How did I get interested in food politics? How did I end up at NYU? How did we create the food studies programs? How did I write my books? All of those kinds of things that seemed very, what do I eat? All of those really personal questions. I tried to address that from the standpoint of somebody who grew up in the 1950s, when opportunities for women were very, very limited. When I was in high school, women were expected to get married and have children as soon as possible. And my three closest friends in high school wanted to marry a professor, a doctor, and a rabbi, respectively, and they all did. They had very clear goals. I was very impressed by that. But I came from a very poor family. I didn't even have those kinds of expectations. And so a lot of the book was about how long it took me to figure out what I wanted to do and what I was good at. And that's why it's called Slow Cooked. It took a long time to get to that point. The book came out last week. People are already reading it and saying very nice things about it. And in particular, young people are telling me that the book comes in as an enormous relief to them, because they don't know what they want to do, and how terrific that I'm being so. I tried to be very, very honest in this book and very candid. I tend to be kind of blunt anyway, so it wasn't that hard to do. But they tell me that they're finding it useful in thinking that they've got time to work on their careers. So if it helps people do that, and helps people understand that the women's issues were really profound in those years, and they still are, but I think they were tougher then in a lot of ways, then that'll be useful. And for anybody who's interested in politics, in answer to the question that I also get asked, which how did I get so courageous about taking on the food industry, I can explain it in a phrase: I had tenure.
Whether you had tenure or not, Marion Nestle, it was very brave what you did, and you got a lot of flack for it. I think that's a polite way of putting it. You a lot of criticism. You were called a lot of names, and I wonder, there are so many advocates in the room right now who are constantly criticized, whether it's on social media or to their face or whatever. What advice do you have for them as they fight the good fight, as they're trying to improve our food and agriculture systems?
Well, in my case, if you write a book with the title Food Politics, you need to expect to be engaging in politics. And the criticism, I felt the criticism was political, that it really wasn't personal, although I did have a lot of trolling on my blog. That was very personal, and I just stopped the comments on the blog. That took care of that. But I think you have to expect criticism. You won't get criticized unless you're doing some good. So you have to look at criticism as you're having an effect. If you're trying to change the food system to one that is more equitable, more just, reaches more people, reaches people who need it more, you're going to be stepping on a lot of toes. And you're going to be stepping on the profits of some very, very big corporations. You can't expect them to take that lying down. And they've got huge public relations apparatuses that are going to go after you and try to undermine what you're doing. And I mean, I've always interpreted the criticism as being the best flattery I could possibly get. I guess I must be hitting a nerve. Good. That's what I'm trying to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you have hit a nerve in so many good ways. So thank you for that. This final question of our last few minutes is kind of for me, it's a controversial one, because I talk about our food and agriculture systems. I talk about the food movement in the United States. I go back and forth about whether there really is a food movement, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, there is and there isn't. I taught a class at NYU in food sociology, and it was a food movements class. And the food movement, which is composed of literally, in the United States alone, thousands and thousands of organizations working on agricultural issues, working on hunger issues, working on chronic disease issues. The issues are different, and the groups don't talk to each other. There are very, very few coalitions of groups working on hunger, for example. There's one big coalition, but I want the groups to get together. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Food Tank is trying to do, is to bring, and it's why I like Food Tank so much, but it's trying to bring these groups together to focus on common issues, somehow setting up common goals and having enough people involved in it so that they can get some political power. Sure. If you're a little organization with a few people and you're spending all your time raising money to pay your staff, you don't have any time to work on big picture issues. But it's the big picture issues that really need the work. And everybody needs to be thinking about how we can do, if I had one policy that I would do overnight, it would be to get rid of all the food banks. Because I think they take up an enormous amount of time and energy for what is an extremely downstream solution that's never going to end. People need to be fed, of course they do, but how about where was that cliche? I want that cliche back. Teach people how to fish. Give people jobs. Give people money. Give people something so they can take care of their own food needs, and put all those food banks out of business. And then all of the people who are working in food banks, and there must be hundreds of thousands of people who are volunteering in them, maybe could be using all that energy to focus on policies in Washington, which would make all of our lives much easier.
Hear, hear. What a great note to end on. Please, more applause for Marion Nestle. Come on. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is maybe the fourth conversation I've had with her over the last few weeks, on stage, and it's different every time, and I am incredibly inspired every time. So thank you, Marion. I now have the pleasure to introduce a very special conversation. So please join me in welcoming our next moderator, Alejandro Figueroa, a reporter for WOSU-NPR, which is an affiliate in southwestern, I think, Ohio. He will be speaking with a dear, dear friend of Food Tank, who is also a member of our advisory group, and one of the nation's most respected labor leaders, Baldemar Velasquez of the Food Labor Organizing Committee. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hello? Oh, yes, it does. Okay. So, by the way, I figured I'd start here. I like bullet points and data. And so today's World Food Day. And in this country, we have 2.4 million farm workers. And the majority of these workers are Latino and Latina immigrant workers. And, it's a $1 trillion industry for farming and agriculture. And the great irony is that about a third of those workers live below the poverty line. And, these are the people that harvest, right, and package the food. And so I figured, if you could just paint us a picture from both your personal and professional experience of what the reality is like of being a migrant farm worker in this country.
Well, we are the people that are subject to a lot of your efforts, a lot of your advocacy in terms of hunger, minimized conditions in the workplace, underpaid, exploited. Taking off on Marion's last point, and which great presentations. The previous talks, is many of you are involved in advocacy groups, but you need to partner with groups that are the recipients of your support, because they need to get up and rise up and start demanding these things for themselves. And this is what I do with the agricultural workers. Having been raised as a migrant farm worker from South Texas, migrating to the north, eventually over to Florida, all over the country, harvesting every fruit and vegetable you can think of. If you've eaten it, I've probably picked it at one time. And that the travesty of the systemic abuses in the food system is continued all these decades. It's still prevalent today. And it is not just a national crisis. I call it a crisis, but it's a global crisis, because we don't survive as agricultural workers in a vacuum. We're tied to the world's food production. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we have in terms of not only how you address that from a political point of view, a social point of view of advocacy, but also what do we do with the people that are on the bottom? Where's their voice? Why aren't they speaking out for themselves? Why aren't they rising up and demanding a fair day's pay for a fair day of work, so we can do what, as Marion was suggesting, feeding and clothing and educating our own families and not rely on handouts for it? So I think that that's the issue that I focus on in terms of how do I motivate the people on the bottom to rise up and address the endemic inequities in the food supply system, so that we can end up self-determination is the word, and not rely on handouts and sympathy from the public to survive.
Yeah, and this, you say it's a global issue, and I wonder if you can talk about what are some of those conditions, at least globally, beyond this country.
Well, in 2018, I think the United Nations issued a special report by the Special Rapporteur on the right of food for agricultural workers in the world. And he indicated that 1/3 of the world's working population are agricultural workers. And that's 1.3 billion farm workers. And they're 90-some% of them are informally employed. Informal. That means they have no direct contract agreement to guarantee wages, conditions, or anything like that. So that equivalent in the United States are these independent labor contractors that come with crews that we see them all over the United States that minimize wages for the workers, notorious for stealing the workers' wages. And but we're part of a global supply system because most farmers in the United States that grow the crops are suppliers to major manufacturers and retailers that are global. And so we're competing with our counterparts in the very same commodities that we do in this country. Let me give you one example. Now, we represent a lot of tobacco workers. Now, tobaccos may not be considered food, but I'll tell you, every tobacco grower is a very diversified farmer, and you have to look at the farm economy as a whole, not just one particular commodity. And so you organize the tobacco workers, you got them automatically organized that the workers that harvest like sweet potatoes, right now in North Carolina, Thanksgiving around the corner, sweet potatoes, cucumbers. We even have wine growers, grape growers. Those growers harvest 32 different crops. So that diversification is one of the features that all these workers are employed in. But where are the deep pockets in the agricultural system that runs, say, through the Deep South? There are these big global manufacturers. They're the Reynolds American. They're the Walmarts that are supplied by these small family farmers. So we have to figure out a way to organize that workforce in order to collectivize some kind of systemic changes in that supply system, not only locally but internationally.
Yeah, and well, you've been doing that for decades. How do you do that? How do you sort of begin that organizing?
One of our current initiatives with tobacco, we affiliated FLOC to the International Union Federation, and we had them convene all of the tobacco sector unions throughout the globe 4 years ago in Malawi, because Malawi is one of the counterpart countries that tobacco is bought by American companies. There's a broker company, Alliance One, in Greensboro, North Carolina, that contract a huge part of the tobacco production in North Carolina. They also have invested in production in Malawi. We visited their counterpart operation there, and when we talked to the workers there, I asked them, well, how much do you get paid here? They said, well, I asked them by the hour, so we don't get paid by the hour, we get paid by the day. And when you calculated the conversion to the dollar, they were getting paid 85 cents a day. And so I told our workers in the United States, who are guest workers, they come with a visa to work for Mexico to harvest the tobacco here in North Carolina. The prevailing wage under the Department of Labor's adverse effect wage rate, it's the prevailing wage this year is $14.16 an hour. I said, how are you going to compare what you're making here to that 85 cents a day in Malawi? And it's the same tobacco that to make the product that they're intentionally investing in other countries, and this is true of every commodity that they purchase. So that drives poverty in those countries. There's over 70 million child laborers in this system, those workers. And when you talk about hunger, the right to food, the ability to have a sustainable life in your country so you don't have to migrate, that's driven by what Marion said, the investors pressing their suppliers to return as much profit as possible.
Yeah, and when you start talking about some of those inequities, I was actually very surprised, and I was doing a bit of my homework for this talk, that in the farming industry, at least here in the United States, federally, children can start working as, at the age of 12. How do you sort of begin to address some of those things? What's the story there? When you're talking about addressing some of those inequities.
I started working in the fields when I was 5, 6 years old, alongside my siblings, my mom and my dad, and up through my college years, working in the fields. And it wasn't that because my parents believed in child labor. The alternative to that was not eating. And literally, that's the case that I'm talking about in this global situation with all agricultural workers. So we have to figure out a mechanism how to organize that lower part of the workforce and go up the supply chain and demand a restructuring of the systemic inequities that are inherent in that supply chain. We did that with 86 with Campbell Soup. After an 8-year tomato strike and a 7-year boycott, Campbell's finally in 86 did what the whole world said they would never do, that they would never negotiate an agreement with a group of workers that were not their employees. We were the employees of the farmers. But I realized, having started wanting to be an engineer, I had a good grasp on math skills in those days, and you learn to examine the whole universe of the problem. And I studied the supply chain, and it's all in the numbers. When you pay a tomato farmer they were being at $34 a ton, and we were getting paid 16 cents a hamper to pick the tomatoes. 33-pound baskets, 60 hampers make a ton, right? That's about $9 or so out of that $34. And everything else that he has to invest in the transplants, in the fertilizer, and everything he needs is machinery, diesel. The prices of those items are way up now with inflation. And how do you marginalize that farmer and expect him to increase our wages? It's not going to happen unless that manufacturer does something to maintain that farm so that we can enjoy the continued employment. So that's exactly what we did. We got Campbell's to increase the price of the ton of tomatoes, double the wages of the workers, and we made them pay for a health insurance policy for the workers, so we'd have to rely on those handouts of those federally funded migrant clinics. And so we talk about it's all in the numbers, and you compel them to, in an independent structure and agreement, in order to change that structure in the pricing system. So the first word that comes to my mind is sustainability. How do we create a sustainable model in the supply chain, not only locally, regionally, but internationally, so that we don't have to compete with unequal competition in other countries?
Yeah. And, what are some ways that you see perhaps, organizations like yours, other non-government agencies, state governments, and federal governments sort of coming together to find some of these solutions? Like, what do you want to see to create some of these sustainable systems that, are equal, or I guess, are equal to all people, I guess?
I think there has to be a new initiative in this country. I think that the narrative that we have in this country on agricultural workers, in agriculture, it misses some things. Most policy in Washington is driven by the West Coast because of the heavy agriculture there. Nancy Pelosi, of course, is from the West Coast. And farming on the West Coast is a lot different than the middle part of the U.S. You got a lot of corporate farming over there. You've got farms that harvest year-round. From Baja California all up, now with the U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement, there's nothing to impede the goods coming from Mexico into the U.S. So some of those farmers can plant in Mexico and import food as if it was here in the U.S. The losers in that system are these farmers that are suppliers to these same grocery store chains, manufacturers and retailers like Walmart and Costco's that don't have that ability to grow crops in other countries. And so they get marginalized in terms of the pricing, the forcing of the prices down, less benefits for our members that come work on those family farms. That has to change. So there has to be a coalition of small family farmers and farm workers to demand up the supply chain and push Congress to connect workers' wages, farmers' commodity prices with the retailers and manufacturers. There has to be some system of pushback because right now there's no legal framework for that to happen. The only way it can happen right now is having independent measures like we are and pushing like a cry in the wilderness, but that has to happen.
And you mentioned earlier that there's a narrative that's sort of being lost with some of these migrant farm workers. Right now, I think a lot of the work that you do to change some of these systems is collective bargaining and unionizing and organizing. But I think right now, like as of recently, unions memberships have been, up and up, compared to previous years. And you might have seen Amazon and Starbucks making headlines, some of these workers unionizing, but what is some of that narrative that is being lost in the context of some of these migrant workers?
Well, first of all, agricultural workers are excluded from all the labor legislation in this country since 1935 when they passed the National Labor Relations Act. And in those years, most agricultural workers were black. And so President Roosevelt needed the Southern Dixiecrats to support that, to pass that legislation, and their condition was you exclude agriculture and domestic workers. And so we've been excluded from that framework since 1935, and every change since then, we're still excluded. The current efforts in Congress right now, it continues to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers. So we have no legal framework. I'm not saying to include that in the current framework that's now, because that doesn't fit agriculture. There has to be a set-aside law to create a legal framework. The alternative to do that is do what FLOC has done, create independent frameworks like we did with Campbell Soup. Then we followed up with Heinz USA and Velasquez Pickle and Aunt Jane and Green Bay Foods that are subsidiaries of Dean Foods, the big dairy company out of Chicago, and then more recently the Mount Olive Pickle Company in North Carolina. We have to continue to create those independent frameworks until maybe we get the attention of Congress to do something nationally.
Yeah. It's about restructuring a framework that really wasn't built to support a lot of these farmers and all these people.
Never has been. It hasn't been.
Yeah. How do you, what makes you, find some type of, optimism and all of this in these conversations that we're having and finding sort of some of the solutions to addressing some of those frameworks?
Well, I guess this is the challenge. And the reason very few people are organizing farm workers because it's hard. And nobody's handing you a blank check to do it. So you have to do it out of desire to want to do something for somebody else, only because I grew up that way. And let me tell you what drives me. Every time I go into a migrant labor camp, I feel like I'm going home. And it's not the nicest home in the world. It may be squalor, but I grew up in that. And when I see those women in those shacks, and I see those men in those shacks, I see my mom, and I see my dad. And most of all, what I remember is the anger that I felt about how they were treated. Being poor was one thing. Being hungry was one thing. But being poor, I've surmised that it's an inconvenience. But one thing that you cannot take is the way they treated your mom and the way they treated your dad, the wage theft on purpose that you could figure out, and the way those field men and those supervisors, the language they use with my mother and that mistreatment is something that a young man cannot take. And when I see them and I look into their eyes and I see the pain that they're going through, it just revives me. And I said, no, this has got to stop. And I got to find more people like me out there. I'm always looking for them. And if you want to come out one of these days and join me, you'll see what I mean and what I'm talking about. Because we got to do something. We can't strike out blindly and say, we're going to attack this guy because of what he did to us. No, you got to talk about what drives the situation. What is the structure and the framework that person exists? I know some of these farmers, they do things out of desperation because they want to survive too.
Yeah. Baldemar, that's all our time. And I appreciate it. Yeah, like it says we're over. And I really appreciate it. And you know, it is about recognizing those systems because it is still ongoing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Another round of applause for Baldemar Velasquez. He is a true American hero. I misspoke earlier and called FLOC the Food Labor Organizing Committee. It's the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, FLOC. Send them money. They deserve all of our support. I want to thank that panel again. They were just wonderful. Before we turn to the next conversation of the day, we're going to share a video from Raphael Podselver, the head of UN advocacy at ProVeg International, who's organizing the Food for Climate Pavilion at COP27, which Food Tank is helping co-lead. And I said there are at least four right now, food pavilions at COP. So over to Raphael.
Good morning, everyone. This is Raphael Podselver. I'm head of UN advocacy with the food awareness organization ProVeg International in Berlin. Today, on World Food Day, I would like to insist on the importance of bringing food systems discussion and discussions around food and agriculture to the COP and to the climate and environment in general communities. We know that food systems in general account for more than 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions. Yet in the past, we've seen that the topic of food and agriculture or diets were not at the center of the discussion and negotiations. This year, this is changing, and we're very happy to share with you that we are co-organizing with Food Tank, Compassion in World Farming, 4PAWS, IPES Food, and A Well-Fed World, the Food for Climate Pavilion. So we'll have 2 weeks of discussions during the COP around topics as dietary shifts towards more healthy plant-rich diets, but also sustainable, resilient agricultural practices of food loss and waste. And we'll do all that with a lens focusing very much on just transition and the role of youth and future generations. So we look very much forward to welcoming you at the Food for Climate Pavilion in Sharm el-Sheikh, and we wish you a great day today with Food Tank. Thank you so much.
A huge thanks to the Food for Climate Pavilion. They've just been such a pleasure to work with. I am now excited to introduce our panel about farmers and markets. So please join me in welcoming our next moderator, Aaron Edwards, a dining editor with the Columbus Monthly, who will be joined by the following folks: Ariella J. Brown from BIPOC Farming Network, Jennifer Garner of the College of Medicine and John Glenn College here at OSU, Bart Elmore, who is also at OSU in environmental history and business history, and Leela Klein from the Gem City Market. Round of applause, please.
Thank you. Hello? Hello? It's working. All right. Thank you, Danny, and good afternoon, everyone. And if you're not from Columbus, welcome. We love having you here. We're very proud of Columbus and the fact that Food Tank picked us, so thanks. I'm Erin Edwards. I cover food and drink for Columbus Monthly. I'm most often talking to chefs, eating out a lot. It's a good gig. And it gets better because I get to talk to some really smart folks today about our food system. Let's see. So our four panelists have very different areas of expertise. I have to admit, at first I was like, how in the world are we going to pull this all together? But they're all working to address impacts of decades of farming consolidation, as well as an agriculture system with a history of racism, displacement, and inequality. So what I'd like to do is kind of start with the past, lay some groundwork, and we have a historian here. So Bart, I'm not expecting you to cover the history of Monsanto in a couple minutes, but last year you did put out a book on the history of Monsanto called Seed Money, and it's a great title, by the way. In the introduction, you talk about how Monsanto told farmers that genetically engineered seeds would set them free. Can you share a bit about that history and what we can learn from it?
Well, thanks, Aaron. And shout out to my friend who came up with the title of the book. So he deserves all the credit. I thought a lot about the people in the room today and about the short amount of time we'd have and what's the one thing for people that are interested in the food system and how we can make it more just and equitable I'd want to talk about. And you set it up well, Aaron. I think the thing I discovered in this book was the story of dicamba. And I'm going to speak specifically about one herbicide just for a short second because I think it gets to your point. In 2015, Monsanto introduced a technology known as Xtend seeds. And many of you may know about this technology being interested in food, but basically these seeds were designed to allow plants to tolerate two different types of herbicides, glyphosate, which was a Monsanto product Roundup, and then another chemical, dicamba, that you might not have heard about. It's a little bit older chemistry from the 50s and 60s. The problem with dicamba, and Monsanto knew this when I was researching this book, I was finding corporate records, and I was interviewing the top people in the company, some off the record, on the record. They knew about the dangers of dicamba because it drifts. When you spray dicamba in hot temperatures, it can vaporize or volatilize and drift off target onto farms nearby. If you do not have Xtend seeds, and there are no Xtend peaches, for example, there are no Xtend vineyards, for example, your crops are going to get damaged. And that's what's happened for the past half decade. Farmers have been hit by dicamba with no protection from it. And I get phone calls from farmers who stop their combines and fall on a good weather day. And if you're a farmer, you know you don't do that. To say, hey, this is happening. Please talk about this. So that's why I'm here, is to mention that this is happening. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, in looking at what dicamba was doing to farming, said that this is, quote, tearing the social fabric of our farming communities asunder. Pretty damning. And based on my own experience with farmers, that would be the case. So I'll just end by saying this is a live issue. The EPA is considering what to do about dicamba this coming growing season as we go into next year. So as so many people have called for action, I would just say look into dicamba if it hasn't been something that you've experienced, or Xtend, and reach out to the EPA to have your voice be heard. If we're going to create a more just and equitable food system, I'd say this is one of the places we can start and fight.
So from there, yeah, we'll stick a little bit with the history. And Ariella, can you talk a little bit about the movement to celebrate the historical contributions of Black farmers, and then how you helped start the Black Farming Conference?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to speak. So we're really going to shift conversations. But before we do that, to go off of Bart's point, I also just want to say that we are all, affected by what he just talked about. I just think about, because I'm I'm native from the Cleveland area, and we are, if you drink water, think about what happened a couple of years ago with the phosphorus runoff. The entire city of Toledo was shut down because of that. And so to say that, you can be blind from some aspect of agriculture or food or whatever, you can't, because we all live on this earth, and so we need to treat it as such. So to pivot to Black farming, I moved to Dayton about 5 years ago, and so now I work with an organization called Agraria, the Center for Regenerative Practice. It's in Yellow Springs, Ohio, north of Dayton. And if you're not familiar with Agraria, it's an organization that was founded by Arthur Morgan, who was actually the second president of Antioch College. And one of the things that Agraria does is they offer a ton of different conferences. And when I first met the executive director of Agraria, they were in the very early stages of planning a Black farming conference. And one of my colleagues, former history professor, Dr. Kevin Magruder, who works at Antioch College, knew about a lot of the history and a lot of around Black farmers in the area, and said we should definitely do a conference specifically focused on the really all of the contributions around Black farming and the history of it. And so in 2020, when we were all sitting in our living rooms because we were really under the pandemics, we had to figure out a way to really support the work that we had planned for that entire year. And so we decided to have an online Black farming conference. And one of our speakers, her name is Dr. Annalisa Cox, and she wrote the book, The Bone and the Sinew of the Land, America's Forgotten Black Pioneers. And it's a story of Black farmers who really migrated to the north or the west of the United States, which was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and there were Black farmers that really were here cultivating the land before pre-Civil War, so before before this was even the state of Ohio. And we had a 2-day conference that was really focused on the celebration of my ancestors and underrepresented farmers. And 3 years to today, we're going into our 4th year of the conference, and so it's really an opportunity to celebrate the work that our ancestors did to help build this country. And I'll just end by saying that my colleague, who is also on the planning committee, she summed it up really well and said, "Africa is our roots, but America is our home."
Let's see, Jennifer. Your work deals with promoting food security at the community level. So what does the future of food security work look like?
Wow, big question, but I appreciate it. And so as it relates to food security promotion at the community level, I want to remind us where we've been and where we're going with research specifically. So I'm a professor here at Ohio State. 75% of my time is spent on research, and actually many of my students and trainees are in the audience, and so it's a big honor. Yeah, waving. And so when I was training, I learned a lot about food security, a really calorie-centric approach to thinking about food and whether we have enough food, right? Us as individuals and our households getting sufficient access to enough food on a consistent basis. Now we're starting to talk, especially going into and coming out of the White House conference, about nutrition security. And I'm a credentialed health professional, a registered dietitian. I do care about nutrition. So yes, we care about the nutritional adequacy of our diet and whether it's promoting health equity. But I invite all of us, and especially those of us doing research, to think about community food security. It's a broader vision that, yes, encompasses nutritional adequacy, but also whether our food is safe, to the point of our conversation so far, whether it's culturally appropriate, and whether it's maximizing community self-reliance. This theme has come up already today, and I'll tell you some of the work we've been doing in rural Appalachian, Ohio during the pandemic. We recently did a series of community conversations to debrief on our work with the community to understand food security dynamics during the pandemic and food sourcing dynamics. And what was palpable in those conversations is the frustration. We talk about the Farm Bill and how 75% of it is food assistance programming. What we hear is, yes, there is need for those programs, but these communities, our neighbors, don't want to need these programs. They want to get to a place, and we as researchers need to understand how we can play a role in helping communities get to this place of communal self-reliance. And so I invite us to have that broader vision in our work. And I think for me, what that looks like in terms of the future is when I started in this role, a colleague who's not at Ohio State, but warned me, I think kindly, to not do community engaged research. That was not how you get tenure. And I'm a very stubborn person, so I didn't listen at all. And I said, well, we'll see what happens, and we will see what happens because I'm not yet tenured. So a little risky here, but our students, our trainees in the crowd need to see us, someone based in a college of medicine, doing research where I'm talking to farmers, I'm evaluating new market models, and also thinking about nutrition and health outcomes and equity. And my hands are shaking a little bit because this is all very disconcerting, and it's a big vision. But that's, for me, what the future looks like, is researchers like myself doing community-engaged, transdisciplinary research that's really thinking about how do we innovate in a cross-sector way to promote and achieve this vision. So I think that's what the future looks like. And what the future looks like is all of, and I just want to take a moment. Every student, trainee in the audience, can you please stand up?
Awesome.
Nice. You guys, that's what the future looks like.
So, speaking of community self-reliance, Leela, can you tell us more about your work in West Dayton and the Gem City market?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just hearing a through line here that, all throughout the day, community self-determination is really key, but also understanding that we do exist in a broader food system, and you can't actually escape the externalities of the system. No matter where you live, no matter how great your local farmers market is, we're all reliant on a food system. So in Dayton, Ohio, which is where I'm from, we have been deeply impacted by the consolidation in the grocery industry. So we know that with the announcement of a planned merger between Kroger and Albertsons, we're going to see more than half of our grocery infrastructure owned by 4 or 5 companies very soon, right? And so the move, I think, Dr. Nestle said, it's not that these food companies are full of people who have nefarious ends, it's that they're accountable to shareholders and that they want to maximize profit, and it makes more sense, they can make more profit in large suburban, often, or exurban footprints for grocery stores. Superstore settings are a way to maximize profit, but that leaves communities like Dayton behind. So we have, in Dayton, we had 60 to 80,000 people living without access to a supermarket that actually had a produce department or fresh meat, so not including your Dollar Generals. Community members came together over the past 7 years and developed what would become the Gem City Market, which is a community and worker-owned supermarket operating in West Dayton, which is a neighborhood that is predominantly African-American, but also has been historically a Jewish neighborhood in Dayton, and it has been sort of a multicultural neighborhood. We're owned by over 5,000 community members and are beginning to be owned by our 30 employees. We're serving 400 Daytonians with groceries, access to groceries every single day, and we're about a year from opening our doors, so we still talk in toddler terms. We're 17 months old, and we're still figuring out how to be a sustainable grocery store in a food system that is dominated by large corporate actors who have access to resources and supply chain that we don't have. But this is an example, I think, and the reason I'm represented on the panel is of community self-determination and sort of innovation in the space led by the community that's impacted by the system.
So quick follow-up. I gather there had been many failed attempts to bring in traditional grocery stores. So was there some skepticism you had to overcome?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Well, the group of folks who came together were community people, were neighbors and community organizers and activists. And the city had so our last Kroger supermarket had closed in 2009 during the height of the housing crisis in Dayton. And the city had tried to incentivize many different kinds of supermarket models to come and open in Dayton, and to no avail. And so when a group of sort of ragtag neighbors and activists and organizers and the faith community and the labor community came together and said, hey, we think we're going to try to open our own supermarket, there was a lot of skepticism. We worked hard. We built a business plan that was based both on community-led market studies, so real, meaningful community-engaged research by one of my colleagues who's a community research-based sociologist. And then we also, used best business practices and hired industry consultants. And so we were able to address the skepticism, inspire over 5,000 people to get involved, and open our doors last May.
So to everyone, free for all, Are there any other key opportunities for innovation related to farms and markets you'd like to highlight in your scholarship or work? Don't all speak at once. Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is a non-answer, so I'll start with that. I think, and maybe I misunderstood my training, but trained as a behavioral interventionist, I understood my task originally to be as an innovator. In even if you're community placed innovator, perhaps coming up, and especially as a nutrition educator and a dietitian, to come up with new curricula, new programs that we can implement and test and see if they work and maybe scale. And very quickly I realized I am not the innovator. I'm a facilitator, an evaluator, a convener, perhaps. And certainly I have a lot of resources at my disposal to do all those things. The innovation is already happening in our communities. It's happening at Gem City Market and other models like that. And so I think that's what we need to look at is, yes, there are these innovative models. For example, a couple of the models that I was studying in partnership with a trio of excellent nonprofits, the Appalachian Center for Economic Networks, Rural Action, and Community Food Initiatives down in southeastern Ohio, so shout out to them. They do this program called Country Fresh Stops, where they're procuring locally grown produce for sale at small local retailers and pop-up markets. So those markets they don't have purchasing power like some of our broader markets do, but they want to sell these things, right? Mm-hmm. That's part of their local values. And so these nonprofits are acting as a middleman in a way, making that happen, both for markets and for nonprofit agencies. So there are these models out here. We need to find them. We need to study them, evaluate, elevate them, and scale them potentially.
So I want to move to looking at the future of food. Bart, bringing you back in here. One of the most powerful players in the food system is, of course, Bayer, which now owns Monsanto. And Bart, after seed money came out last year, I hear they reached out to you.
Yeah, Bayer came to Ohio State. That was strange for me.
Intimidating?
They came to my house, actually, and looked at my kids, talked about my kids' paintings on the wall and all this stuff, and then joked that they actually know where I live now. So it was a really interesting experience and exchange. But I think one of the things that I really took away from that is that even people inside the company see the gig is up. That agriculture has to be something different. That to create an equitable and sustainable agricultural system, one of the biggest things is we've got to get off petrochemical dependencies. And that this model, if you go back to the introduction of Roundup Ready technologies in 1996, and you look to today, that's the one thing that's useful as a historian. I didn't go into this as somebody who wanted to have a bias. I wanted to say, okay, what does the data show us? And it shows us in the case of herbicides that we're now using, in some cases, twice as much as we did in 1996. We're not using less petrochemicals, we're more dependent. And the thing that really stood out for me as a historian is that you think about dicamba or 2,4-D and these herbicides that are being used today. We're not going forward in history, we're going backwards. 2,4-D is 1940s chemistry. That's a model. We're being promised that it's this futuristic future. But if you really look at it from a historian's angle, that's not the way to go. And I think even people inside Bayer, I'm happy to say, get this. Now, whether they will actually move on it is another question. And I'm realistic about that. But the data is clear. And that's why I wrote this book when I did. It was 25 years since the anniversary of the first introduction of GE crops. And again, it's about the deployment of them. What could CRISPR unlock? Okay, these are good questions, but if we look at history, we have to do it differently than the way we did it the last 25 years.
So we have... So we're running out of time, but I wanted to bring it back to our theme for World Food Day, leave no one behind. So I just want to ask you each, what does that mean to you in the context of our food future? I'll start here.
Yeah, I think let community lead, center with the people who have been most disproportionately negatively impacted by the way that our food system has run, whether that be farmers, whether that be communities, neighbors. Don't leave them behind, let them lead. That's what I would say.
I think creating opportunities for us to get to know the people that produce our food, and we've heard some voices here today. You know, getting to travel as somebody who wrote about Coca-Cola and other things, I hadn't really worked in farming, you know, the history of agriculture, and just spending time with people to hear their stories changed me as a person and as a scholar. So I think creating avenues to leave no one behind means having conversations, getting to know your farmers, getting to know the people that produce your food, and caring about them, and finding ways that we can create those connections through the great organizations that are all represented here.
Mm-hmm. So I would just echo what Leela and Bart said. I think it's really about kind of getting outside of your comfort zone and talking to people who don't look like you and supporting what they're doing and understanding that we really are going backwards. Someone said earlier the whole buzzword around regenerative agriculture. It's really all about leaving the land better than what you found it, and we're essentially looking at practices that have already been created by our indigenous brothers and sisters and our African people. And so just really making sure that we are supporting people that don't look like us and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table, whatever that looks like for you.
Okay, Jennifer, real quick.
Okay. Absolutely echo everything that's been said, and I will say, I'll add to that we need to understand the disparities that currently exist when it comes to nutrition and health outcomes, but then we need to flip that mindset, take an assets-based perspective, and understand with optimism what opportunities exist, and make sure that the table is composed of diverse folks like us here, where, you know, at the beginning, like you said, we were wondering what do we all have in common. Actually, we need our research and our efforts, our community efforts, to look like this. And so I think that's what is happening to the least of us. That's what we all need to care about right now.
All right. I think that is all for us today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. As they're exiting, another round of applause. They deserve it. Thank you, Erin, and all of the panelists. I'm going to introduce our next speaker in just a moment, but first I'd like to play a video from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations around World Food Day.
8 billion people, one agri-food system. Conflict, climate change, slowdowns and downturns. Inequality, rising food prices. Are denying progress to many, limiting progress for us all. What affects one impacts many. Sustainability starts with equal opportunity. Equal opportunity for farmers, producers, and consumers, and care for the environment. Let's build a world with more and good quality food that is safe, nutritious, and affordable for all. Leave no one behind.
Thanks again to FAO for being such a great partner, and we can't leave anyone behind when we're talking about food and agriculture systems. It is now my pleasure to introduce Zia Ahmed, the Senior Director of Dining Services, to say a few words about his work at OSU.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I just have a few minutes, so I'm going to go really fast, so please bear with me here. So we're so fortunate to have this event at The Ohio State University, very fortunate to host you over here. So humans are storied beings, and we live storied lives, right? So I'm going to start with my personal story with food. So years ago, when I was born in Bangladesh, my mom used to tell me a story about me being very young and being food insecure. She passed away a couple of years ago, and she would tell me that Bangladesh was going through a major famine at that time, and soon after I was born. And so my family often have to wait in line, sometimes multiple lines, because the government was rationing food, and sometimes multiple lines because if you wait in line for a long time, and by the time it's your turn to get food, the shelter may run out of food, right? So that's why you have to wait in multiple lines. So my mom would tell me stories about how many nights that I went to bed crying because I didn't have enough food to eat. And I'm so fortunate that now I'm in front of you today, World Food Day, talking about food, right? And also every day is a gift. I'm very fortunate to run one of the largest college university dining operations in the country. Speaking of one of the largest college university dining operation at The Ohio State University, we are one of the most comprehensive, one of the largest, and also one of the most affordable college dining program in the country. So we serve on a typical day almost 40,000 people, and across 35 operation in 5 different campuses, right? And it's just not serving food, but we have a great responsibility as part of the Office of Student Life to develop young people. We're not in food service business. We're in the business of student development. What we do is serve food. And part of that student development process is making sure that we're creating informed consumer of food. And there are many ways that we do that. So our students, we understand, are influencers in our food system. Like all of us are influencers in our food system because we're a consumer of food. The way we make our buying decision of food, we influence the food system. Now, many of us, if not all of us, sometimes have a different varying degree of influence in the food system. Me, running a large dining operation, have a greater degree of influence in the food system, maybe than an average consumer. So we understand that these students are going to one day graduate and go into their chosen profession, whether they're as a social worker, a doctor, engineer, or a nurse, you name it, policymakers, government officials. We want to make sure whatever profession they choose, that when they're there, they're being thoughtful when they're making decisions that impacts the food system. So our global food systems are very well connected, and it has lots of opportunities. It's been developed over hundreds of thousands of years, right? And we know there are a lot of opportunities there. So our job is to make sure that whatever we can do to create 100% transparency in our food system by exposing the food system to this wonderful young people, and hopefully one day they're going to make great decisions. So those are all the few things I have to say. One other thing I want to mention at the last minute is that our chefs have prepared a wonderful menu for you. So immediately after the events over here in this room, there will be food served over there. So I'm not going to go into the details. I was planning on doing it, but I want to make sure I save some time over here. So thank you for being here. Hopefully you're going to stick around to enjoy some of the great food that our chefs have prepared. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Zia. That was great. The power of eaters and influencers is such a great thing to point out. For our next conversation, I'd like to invite Matthew Rand, a reporter and host with WOSU-NPR and former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman, to the stage. And while they're coming up, I just want to say a few words about Secretary Glickman. He and I agree on a lot of things, and we also disagree on a lot of things. But I have to say, right after Food Tank started in 2013, he graciously had me in his office, and I asked him a lot of advice. And so since then, I consider him not only a friend, but a mentor. So thank you, Secretary Glickman.
Well, thank you all. Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Matthew Rand. I'm one of the reporters here at WOSU, the building you're sitting in, and we're thrilled that you're here. It's a brand new building, and we're excited to have people in it for a change, so that's very nice. Secretary Glickman, Russia's invasion of Ukraine threatens to plunge millions more people around the globe into acute food insecurity. Closer to home, food insecurity remains a serious issue as well, affecting some 1 in 10 U.S. households last year. Diet-related illnesses are among the leading causes of early death and disability across the nation. And I want to talk about first, before we get to the international scene, talk about hunger in the U.S. As I just said, 1 in 10 U.S. households affected by food insecurity. Can you dig down deeper into what that means?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks to Danny for having me. I really enjoyed all the presentations, especially the last one, the lived experiences. Now, I hope you won't hold it against me. I went to this college about 250 miles north of here. All right. Now, my parents sent me there. If I had my choice, I would have found another place. But I appreciate the cooperation and the hospitality that you at Ohio State are giving a Michigan grad today. So thank you.
We won't hold it against you.
We won't hold it against you. So, look, we've got all sorts of problems in this world. But let me talk a little bit on the glass half full for a moment, because we've heard a lot about the glass half empty, which I think is important because there are a lot of defects in our system. But, we still feed about 335 million people a day. That is not an easy task to do. Just imagine this massive supply chain and comprehensive transportation, logistics, agriculture, everything in the world. And not perfectly, as we've seen today, but by and large, it could work better. There are things on the horizon that are going to make it work better, I think. But it is remarkable that we do that. Second of all, you talked about the White House Conference on Nutrition and Hunger and the '69 conference. The United States of America has the most advanced food security system in the world, bar none. We have about 45 million Americans on the SNAP program. Most of those people aren't on for very long, by the way. They're on, it's countercyclical. They go on when times are bad, and they go off when times are good, or when the economic situation improves. And, of course, today with the inflation rate so high, it's a problem. But you consider SNAP, you consider the WIC program, which is just a remarkable program for anybody who's been on it, and you consider the school meals programs, that the United States is way ahead of everybody in the world in terms of how we feed our people. Okay, so don't think it's just all bad in terms of everything that's out there. It's not all bad. But there are things that we could do to improve it. We still have too many people who don't have access to our federal feeding programs. And I would take a little slight issue with my friend Marion Nestle. I think that, by the way, I used to disagree with her 80%. Now I only disagree with her 40%. So it's gotten really better. But the nation's... Yeah, the Feeding America system and the food bank system is a remarkable way to fill in the gaps for a lot of people who don't take advantage of the SNAP program. And it also allows human contact to take place between people who go to food banks, who need food, who need that social interaction that takes place. And you don't often get that with a EBT card, to be honest with you. And so, it's a good supplement. So I guess my point in all this, with all the problems we face with our food system, and there are plenty of them, there's still a lot of good that takes place in the American food system. And we just need to reflect on that as we work to improve it.
Maybe you can give us a little bit of a historical perspective from your time serving as Agriculture Secretary to now 20 plus years later. What were some of the challenges you faced back then that you were able to chip away at, and what do you see as some of our biggest challenges today?
Well, first of all, the federal feeding programs are about 82% of the Farm Bill. So 18% of the Farm Bill is everything else, from domestic farm programs to a lot of our humanitarian assistance programs. And so that's a positive. That was much different 40 years ago. And so we should be proud of that. I do think that there have been some changes in agriculture, which unfortunately we've talked about today, an immense amount of consolidation in agriculture and all aspects of agriculture and food, from farming itself to the food industry. But of course, we've seen that consolidation in every aspect of American economic system. It's not just the food system. It's the banking system, the transportation system. And obviously, effective enforcement of antitrust laws is an important part of that effort. But there are positive changes that take place. We now have in farming a crop insurance system that it used to say, for example, it used to be that if you grew wheat, then if you wanted to grow peaches or apples or pears on that wheat base, you would lose all your farm program payments on your wheat program just because you wanted to grow the specialty crops. That's now changing. It's encouraging farmers all over the country to grow specialty crops, to grow, I don't like that term, but to grow fresh produce, which is a huge part of people's diet. Big part of American agriculture is monoculture agriculture. It means wheat, corn, cotton, rice, and soybeans tend to dominate plant production. And then, of course, you have the livestock industry, which is a huge part of American agriculture. About half of the production in American agriculture is the production of animals. And so this is a big complicated thing, but more and more we're seeing the American diet change. We're seeing that the healthcare aspects of eating are problematic. And so we have seen more and more interest on the nutrition side of the picture than certainly when I first came to Congress 40 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there are very few places in this country where you can't find something that you can afford to purchase, but maybe not something that is worth buying necessarily food-wise, and that remains a challenge. I know that was one of my my first jobs in journalism was in Eastern Kentucky, very poor part of the country, and it was a food desert, right? It was
well, and access to produce has been a huge problem in low-income communities around the country. And by the way, here's an interesting statistic for you. The Rockefeller Foundation has come out with a report that says that a poor diet is the leading cause of early mortality in the United States and the world. The leading cause. Why? Because it causes cancer. Why? Because it causes cardiovascular disease. And so, you know, traditionally, one of the things that I think is beginning to change in agriculture, and Marion talked about this before, is the recognition that what we eat, what goes into your body, the quality of that food is as important as the quantity of that food. And most of our feeding programs historically have been focused on quantity of food and not the diet quality of food. So more and more interest in, especially if you're on feeding programs, and augmenting fresh fruits and vegetables as part of those feeding programs. But these aren't issues that just affect the poor. As I've said before, our diet is not good across the board. Low, middle, and upper income people all face the fact that we're eating badly. And part of the problem is that our medical community, and I know we're in a university with a great medical team and great researchers, but our medical community has largely avoided the subject of food intake as part of their research and development, and as part of their way of understanding how to make a person healthier. They're very good when you get sick and treating you when you have cancer or heart disease. They're not very good at preventing disease. And so that is a huge part of the issue that we're talking about today, both at home and around the world, and we desperately need to give much more attention and focus on that. This relationship between food and medicine, food, health, and medicine is critical. Most physicians aren't trained in prevention of disease through helping people eat better. Most medical schools don't require courses in nutrition. I recall a few years back, I went down with Donna Shalala, who was the head of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we went down to the University of Miami, and we were looking at their curriculum on their medical curriculum in terms of food and health and prevention, and it was pretty much unchanged from what it would have been 50 years before. So this is another very important subject that I think we need to talk about.
I think there's been a lot of certainly education put toward convincing folks that their diet is so intricately linked with their health and to make better choices. What more needs to be done to, I hate to say win hearts and minds, but convince people?
Well, I think, first of all, the medical community, dietitians and nutritionists are good on this, but by and large, the medical community writ large needs to become much more engaged in the issue of prevention. And so do the medical schools, and so do the schools of agriculture, and so do our research institutions around the country need to give much more attention and focus to preventing disease. And diet is certainly a big part of that. Look, marketing and advertising has a lot to do with this. How many times do you turn on TV and see an ad for fresh blueberries? Well, there's no real money in that kind of ad, to be honest with you. And most of the food that's advertised, both to adults and to children, is high fat, high sodium, high caloric foods. They're calorie dense foods. They're tasty. My mouth waters when I see them. So I think that these are complicated problems. There was this, I think John Maynard Keynes, he was an economist and a philosopher, and he said, for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. And the truth of the matter is, we've got to realize that there are a combination of solutions to all of the issues, food issues we're talking about, but no one issue is going to save the day, for sure.
You and others brought up, of course, the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. Can you talk about some of the goals that came out of that and some of the highlights for you and what progress you saw come out of that?
Well, as Marion said, first of all, the fact that we had a conference and that we had attention to this on a national level, and Danny was there, and Food Tank had a big role in this, and a lot of the anti-hunger groups were very important in this effort, as well as schools and nutrition, and some of the land grants were very involved in this thing. So it elevated the attention. You know, I mean, Napoleon once said that agriculture, he said, war is too important to be left to the generals. And agriculture and food policy is too important just to be left to the foodies. And that was one of the things that the White House Conference did. It brought people in from the private sector, the non-governmental affairs sector, recognizing how important food is. Food and agriculture is to our general economy, to our national security. You mentioned Ukraine. Okay. Who would have thought that the country of Ukraine, I didn't even know this. I was Secretary of Agriculture. I didn't know the impact Ukraine had on the production of sunflower oil and wheat and corn, particularly with North Africa and in the Middle East, and how it impacted prices around the world. These are really, really important issues. Until recently, you talked about the COP conference. Until recently, the G7, the G8, the G20 conferences, they didn't even pay lip service to food and agriculture. You know, they talked about a lot of other things. Now we're beginning to see that people are actually paying attention to the role and power and importance of food and nutrition security, particularly as a way to prevent conflict around the world and in our own country as well.
On the subject of Ukraine, can you go a little deeper into how this is or could very well shake up the world food supply? And then also, is there any, from your time in office, any sort of analogous situations that emerged on the global scale like that threaten food security for folks around the world?
Well, you know, we always have countries trying to protect their own farmers and their own people. So, you know, India is an example of one country that has restricted exports because they didn't want, they wanted to make sure their own farmers and consumers were protected. And that had a dislocative effect in terms of other places in the world because India is a big exporter of wheat in the world. And we're seeing a lot of countries now restrict exports of their products in a way to protect their own economics of agriculture, but in the process hurting other people as well. So we really do need to keep fighting as best we can for free and open trade of agriculture products around the world. Ukraine, it was the breadbasket of Europe. The soil in Ukraine is the thickest in the world. It was the richest soil in the world. And Russia has some of that thick soil too. But the Russians and their insidious acts and just day after day trying to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, they're going to do long-term harm to feeding people in the region of the world that need that grain and soy and sunflower oil and corn. And that's largely Yemen. That's Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria. These are not the places of the most political stable places in the world. So it has great impact. And then, of course, on our own country, it's had some impact on the inflation, the food price rise, as well as the energy issues. Because you can't talk about agriculture without talking about energy. Agriculture is the most energy-dependent industry in the world of any, you know, so, and not only that, we can't talk about this without talking about water. 71% of the water in the world is used to irrigate crops and feed animals. 29% is used for everything else, including the bottles that you got here in this room. And, you know, I mean, it's like you talk about a crisis of the future. That's a potential immense, enormous crisis that the researchers of, especially the land-grant universities and around the world as well, are going to have to look at ways to help us use water more efficiently. Less water to grow plants and feed animals, using new technologies, including biotechnology, to do that kind of thing. And I was glad to see Jocelyn talk about that in terms of the role of science. The other thing I would say here is you are one of the great science institutions in the world, the Ohio State University. And I don't even say that with any reflection on the fact that Michigan is not a land-grant school. So I can say that very clearly to you. But we need to have ample research budgets in the food and agriculture sector in order to ensure that we can feed a hungry world, you know? And that means resources, both at the state level as well as at the national level. Agriculture research budget on the federal government is a paltry, tiny percentage of what we spend on the defense budget research and on the healthcare budget research. And I'm not saying that those are bad. I'm just saying that the dollars are needed in agriculture and food research very desperately.
If you'll pardon the pun, is there an appetite to change that? Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll show myself out.
That's not one of the... Yeah, I think so. It's also very bipartisan. So, we talked a little bit about partisanship and bipartisanship. And one of the things when I was in Congress 100 years ago, and then when I was secretary, is that I would have to say that most food and agriculture issues were bipartisan. Senators Dole and McGovern led the effort to feed America and to feed the world. And John Glenn was a leader in these efforts as well. It's still that way, but not as much as it used to be, because partisanship invades everything now, afflicts almost all kinds of decisions. And so I think it was Marion that talked about that. What we do in terms of making our democracy flourish better is going to have a lot to do with the issues that are being raised in today's conference.
Well, what should be, I guess what is or what perhaps should be the U.S.'s role in providing humanitarian food aid around the world? What's working, what's not?
Well, first of all, we are the largest provider of humanitarian assistance in the world. Jocelyn can talk about it through the World Food Program, which is the UN agency that's kind of the leading effort in that area, and through humanitarian organizations, NGOs, Save the Children, World Vision. There are hundreds of them out there working like mad to save lives every single day. And USAID does a very good job in that. So we have to maintain that commitment on humanitarian assistance, which means, and by the way, it's a nothing. 1% of our national budget, 1% goes into our foreign assistance programs. And out of that foreign assistance programs, a big chunk of that goes to food assistance. 1%. When I was in Congress, I used to have people come to town hall meetings. They said, "We're tired of this foreign aid." I said, "Well, how much do you think goes into foreign aid of our budget?" 50%, I'd hear. 25%, 40%. I said, "How does 1% sound?" And they said, "Well, that doesn't sound right. You better go back, Congressman, and get better numbers." But the truth is it's a very infinitesimal amount that goes into providing humanitarian assistance, and whether that's in Central America, whether that's in South Asia, it's really critically important. It's the one thing that America can be proud of, our sense of leadership in global humanitarian assistance and in our domestic food assistance as well. It doesn't mean that our food programs are perfect, and it certainly doesn't mean that our farm programs solve every problem. And I would reiterate what was said before. This farm bill coming up, if you want a legislative action piece that you could go to work on, that's the place that I would start.
Do you draw a distinction between short-term aid and more long-term programs internationally?
Well, first of all, short-term aid, I assume you mean by that you mean humanitarian assistance to save
Correct,
lives. Yeah. So that's got to be our first priority, to keep people alive. And so they don't die as a result of either famines or political instability like we see in Yemen, which is a big issue right now. Longer-term assistance is to do what somebody else said today, was to try to make these countries more self-sufficient in agriculture, particularly. And we've had some success in some places in the world. USAID, some of the humanitarian organizations, the NGOs have really done wonderful jobs, and there's great examples of it. But that's tougher. We put a huge amount of money in Afghanistan to build their agriculture system. And did it have any long-term effect? Maybe, but probably not worth the billions and billions we've put in. So it's tougher, but that doesn't mean we don't keep trying.
And maybe closer to home, we could talk about, too, the issues you brought up, the programs we have, SNAP, WIC, others, that have been very successful. Are they equipped to confront the issues that we face domestically?
That's a really good question. So the WIC program is a particularly successful program because it focuses on nutritional needs of mothers, pregnant women, mothers of small children, and the metrics there are really good in terms of how people respond and how it improves their health process. The SNAP program over the years has really not focused on nutrition as much as I would like to see it. There is a SNAP Ed part of it that's supposed to help people make better decisions. But quite frankly, when you have the economics have changed, where you have either both spouses working or one-parent families, and kids watching TV all the time, it's hard to make the SNAP program into truly a nutrition program. I wish it were more that way, but you go into families and you talk to parents who are on SNAP, and they want their kids happy. They want to feed their kids what's tasty. And the kids are getting all these images from traditional media and social media that may not be consistent with good nutrition. So I think we could do a lot more in the SNAP program and all of our feeding programs to improve the nutrition of those programs. I do agree with the person who talked about universal school meals. It's crazy that we don't provide universal school meals in this country. I would say to Marion, it's more expensive than the bureaucracy of filling out the paperwork. Let's be honest about it. It's tens of billions of dollars a year, but it's something that our country ought to be doing.
If you could conceive of a new program from the ground up to confront the issues of today and tomorrow, what would that look like?
Well, let me put it like this. There's a lot of players in this. The federal government is a big player because it provides billions for these programs, farm programs and feeding programs. This is encouraging that the private sector is doing a lot more because their shareholders and their stakeholders are demanding it. So I was talking to the lady from Kroger back there and just figuring out the massive amounts of money that are now going into a variety of programs that 25 years ago I doubt you were doing. And so public companies are now getting a lot of pressure from their stakeholders to be much more positive in terms of their ESG type of activities. So I would continue to encourage that. I don't know how many of you are stockholders, but I assume you have pensions, and Ohio State, I'm sure, has a pension and program and everything else. So there are a lot of ways that you can try to encourage the private sector to be much more involved. And it's not just food companies, it's the tech companies. It's Google, Microsoft, Facebook, or Meta, or whatever they call that organization these days. They're the dominant, they're dominant economic players in American society, and they ought to be doing the right thing here in terms of helping constituents with the most basic needs. And one of them, of course, is having an adequate and an ample diet.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation about consolidation in the food industry. What does that look like, and the sort of the pitfalls of that, and what are the roles of smaller farmers and operations across the board?
Our country was founded on competition. It does make a difference. And so what we need to do is generally as a society is to encourage competition where we can. At the same time, the economies of scale are very attractive for companies, not just in agriculture, but look at the airlines, banking, almost every system, you see the economies of scale. So what we need to be doing is providing incentives for people to be entrepreneurial, to start their own operations, their enterprises, to be competitive forces in the marketplace. And and that's easy for me to say because it takes a lot of capital and a lot of just tough, hard work to do that kind of thing. But our capitalist system has a remarkable way of encouraging new thinking, not just in the business world, but in the NGO world, in new thinking, not just going along with the status quo and what we've done in the past. So I think that you've got to have appropriate enforcement of our antitrust laws, but you've got to have opportunities for new people to enter these business lines. And I think that who would have thought? I'm not saying that Amazon is my idea necessarily of I'd like to see Amazons dominate every part of American society, but who would have thought that 30 or 40 or 50 years ago we would have had a company that decided it could distribute about any good in the country, anywhere, any place, and now become the biggest employer in America. And so there's got to be dozens of Amazons and small Amazons, little Amazons out there that can, in fact, encourage people to come in and be a part of the system, and particularly in the food industry, which is ubiquitous. Everybody has to have it. There is no place that it doesn't have. And, so I told this story before in our little round table. Does any of you ever see the movie The Graduate? Remember The Graduate, when Dustin Hoffman was advised by his father-in-law about the business opportunity of the future? Remember what his father-in-law told him? Plastics. Not a good thing today, probably, as we were talking about in terms of the ecosystem. But The secret sauce, I think, today, as much as anything, is food and agriculture and all of its spin-offs. Water conservation, research and technology, health and medicine. And so for those of you in this room, particularly the students, you're in the right place at the right time.
We have just a couple of minutes left, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on next steps for the people in this room, the people making decisions at the federal, state, and local levels across the country. What does the future hold, and what can leaders do to better address the challenges we face?
I think I'd go back to, let's say, here at Ohio State. One of the things you have to make an industry succeed, like food and agriculture, is a talent pool of smart, capable, young, diverse people going into the field and not only getting educated and support from the academic world, but relationships outside once they leave to know that they can make a mark and to save the world. I think it was Jefferson said, one man with courage, now it's one person with courage makes a majority. But the truth of the matter is that I have seen over and over again how one person, even in the agriculture world, can make a big difference. I'm on this board of the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. This is a 501c3 set up by Congress. Congress has put about $400 million in this entity to be matched by the private sector. And you would be just so pleased to see the number of projects, photosynthesis, growing crops faster, using less water, increasing the nutritional yield of crops, that are coming just from schools like Ohio State and big schools and HBCUs and everybody else. So that's the great opportunity I see, is to make sure that our educational establishment is supported to put out a talent pool that will help us solve these problems in the future.
Dan Glickman, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Incredible conversation. Thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. Okay, take care. Please travel safe, sir. I don't know what to say, but I will reiterate that, again, great conversation, but what Dan Glickman said about food is really an opportunity. Our food and agriculture systems should be considered an opportunity, not a punishment as they haven't been in the past or in places like sub-Saharan Africa, but a real opportunity for young people. So really great to hear. It is now my pleasure to bring Denise Osterhues to the stage. So please, she's from Kroger. Please give her a round of applause as we sit down to talk. And let me, while she's taking a seat, introduce her a little bit more formally. She's the Senior Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at Kroger. She's done a lot on aligning ESG strategy, doing a lot of different kinds of policy making, stakeholder engagement, and a number of other things, including strategic philanthropy, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But I do want to jump in because Kroger and Albertsons had some big news this week, and I'm wondering what you can tell me about it.
It is big news.
Big news.
It's big news. We're still getting used to it too. So, appreciate, first of all, being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's important for us to be part of the conversation in the food industry and to represent the companies like Kroger who can be part of the solution. We want to be part of the solution, so please keep inviting us to these conversations.
Of course.
But yes, so big news. So I think it's exciting. So what I think about, we are companies with a common purpose and values. We have a complementary footprint. We both have a highly unionized workforce. So we're hoping it would potentially secure union jobs for the future. It would help us think about a bigger scale to compete with those who are still bigger than us. So I know people think we're big. We're still not as big. And so, our founder opened the first Kroger store, by the way, noting here that we're in Ohio, on the banks of the Ohio River, down in Cincinnati, almost 140 years ago, which is incredible. And we want to be around for 100 more years, 200 more years. We want to continue serving our communities. We want to make a difference. So it is exciting. It's big to think about. I think regulators and others will weigh in the coming weeks and months. It's going to be a long road. And in the meantime, we're separate companies, and it's business as usual. But super exciting to think about what might be possible to do more good.
Sure.
All the things I talk to Danny and Bernie about all the time.
Sure.
And to use our scale for positive change. So that's the hope.
Well, and it's my hope too, because I have known Denise for a long time, and we talk a lot about environmental and sustainability goals. We talk a lot about issues that you and I care about very much, including food loss and food waste. And you've been such a leader on Kroger's Zero Hunger, Zero Waste initiative. This is one of the things that I hope continues as this merger unfolds. Agreed. And you see what happens. But we one of the questions I have for you is, we see all these companies implementing these goals for 2030 or even 2050, and I've told you how this irritates me, because by 2050 the world will be on fire. So I think it's too late. And so I worry that there is this issue of green wishing happening, that companies who, medium, small, and certainly large scale companies are, making all these commitments because they want them to happen, and their consumers want them to happen. But I worry, again, that, there's not enough action. And so I wonder what your advice is at Kroger and for other companies who are listening.
So, my team, I will say, I often say I have one of the best jobs because I get to think about these things for a company like Kroger. So my small and mighty team, we work on sustainability and social impact. We work on a portfolio of 30 plus topics that include food access, health and nutrition, human rights in our global supply chain, animal welfare, climate change, packaging, all the things. And so, and I will say to some of the comments earlier, our investors do care. I talk with, I have the lucky position to be able to talk with our activists, advocacy groups, NGOs, and investors, socially conscious investors, and others who care deeply about what Kroger is doing, and they do ask us and push us to do all the things. So please feel good about that. So yes, investors want a return on their investment, absolutely, financially, but they do also press us, and we, Kroger is a little bit unique too, I think, sometimes, because we have an open door policy and we talk to anyone, we talk to everyone. So clearly. Anyone here,
I said clearly.
Clearly. And I do have I've become more and more candid through the years as I learn about all the things, but I would encourage any of you, so I'm gonna call out my colleagues. Amy in the pink jacket here, she is based in Columbus. She works and leads Kroger's corporate affairs work for the Columbus division. Reach out to her. If you're here, she works with Ohio State folks. She's in the community. Reach out and chat with her. She's been with Kroger a long time, and she knows more than I do. She's been here many years. Patty Leisman next to her is our new head of philanthropy. So she is on my team in Cincinnati, and we do look at philanthropy as a key part of our work because we can strategically bring more resources to the table to unlock some of the things that are really hard. One of the things I would say is, and Danny mentioned it, so we have an ESG strategy, which is called, just to note, Thriving Together, meaning that we want a future where everyone is thriving in the future, people and our planet, by the way. We do have some timeliness and urgency to the work, but the centerpiece of our ESG strategy is our Zero Hunger, Zero Waste social and environmental impact plan, and that is really our commitment to improve food access, improve health and nutrition, leverage food as medicine, improve health outcomes, all very hard things that we're all talking about today. So we need everybody here to help figure it out, but we want to be at the table and there as well.
So, consolidation has come up a lot today in the conversation, and how a lot of folks, don't think that's a good thing. But we have talked a little bit about how you believe, and Kroger believes, that large-scale commercial retail production, large-scale production, and then large-scale retail really need to be part of the problem from your viewpoint if we want true access and affordability. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I would say, I get that there are concerns about large companies, consolidation, et cetera. But what I've learned, it's been an incredibly difficult and challenging year in our world because of increased maybe activism on single issue topics. So, and what we are dealing with is a very complicated food system. So just addressing one topic creates other trade-offs and unintended consequences that we're trying to avoid. So if we want to truly feed a growing global population and not destroy the planet, we need more sustainable food production at scale. I mean, we can do small pilots that are amazing and wonderful, and we need all the local and community markets. But we also have to have large-scale food production that is with really responsible operations, sustainable methods. I mean, in the past year, I've been on tomato fields in Florida. I was on a sow pork production facility in North Carolina, and I was on a farm in Iowa last week, a cattle or beef feed yard and food production operation altogether. And I would say my takeaway is the people who are farming, the ranchers, the producers, the growers, they care, and they are trying to do their best work and trying to earn a living and take care of their workers. My takeaway is, oh my goodness, sows are incredibly huge animals. Cattle are even bigger. And, if you think about the workers trying to tend them and take care of them and take care of them when they're sick and prevent disease, this is just a huge amount of work. But we do need large-scale producers to have the commercial volume that companies like Kroger need to feed our communities, and we are not the largest. So we will need better and more sustainable practices at scale. Love to fund pilots. We do a lot of pilots and work with a lot of partners to, and even through our foundation's innovation fund. So through the Zero Hunger, Zero Waste Foundation, we have deployed an innovation fund to try and direct catalytic capital and seed funding to entrepreneurs, social enterprises. This is actually a public charity specifically so that we can fund market-driven, for-profit innovators and get solutions off the ground, test them, and then hopefully help them get access to more funding so they can scale.
Sure. And in full transparency, I've been an advisor for that project. And watching these young companies, young entrepreneurs really do try to do incredible things is fascinating. But they do need support. They do need investment, whether it comes from Kroger or other investors. That kind of entrepreneurism in food and agriculture needs more attention. I'm wondering if you talked about visiting sows and their gestation crates, and I know you've spent a lot of time, more time on pork and pork operations than any of us would probably like to. The story behind our food is really important for consumers, and retailers have a responsibility in that. And I'm wondering how Kroger and you kind of personally think about that.
Yeah, it's a great area where we can all probably relate because it is, we hear a lot about the stories behind our food and how do we encourage our customers to buy the things we wish they would buy. I often say, everything on our shelves has a story. Who grew it? Who made it? Whether it was in a manufacturing facility or by hand, who harvested it, who drove it, who put it on our shelves, and then who bought it and took it home, and I hope they ate it or used it versus throwing it away. But everything has a story, and what I learned through the experience with fresh pork, and also can talk at length about cage-free eggs, is that those are all really complicated supply chains and food systems in and of themselves. One thing I'm really excited about, I do want to call out, and back to the stories, well, I'll say this first. I can put the most, and that's not me, we collectively can put the most sustainable, humanely raised, equitably produced items on our shelves. But if no one buys them, they're not going to stay on the shelf very long. And that is what I end up worrying about a lot because we work really hard to get amazing products to our shelf. Some of them are fair trade. Some of them are other, responsibly sourced. We work with a lot of partners and other groups to get really good products to shelf that we can all feel good about. Because what we want to do, and even through Zero Hunger, Zero Waste, is we want to give our customers easy ways. Easy. They don't want to think really hard. They want easy ways to live a healthier and more sustainable lifestyle, and that means giving them a wide range of choices that they can feel good about. And they don't want to think and really weigh in and read all the labels, but there are items on the shelf today that we wish people would really understand and learn more about. And it's been, especially through 2 years of pandemic, it's been really hard to break through and tell some of the great stories that are out there because of other things that have been higher priorities on everyone's list. But would love to talk more about that too.
Well, in this inflationary period, you have to make decisions as a retailer whether to keep it cage-free eggs or other, animal welfare certified kind of brands on store shelves. What do you think that will look like? I mean, as the crisis in Ukraine that we heard about earlier continues, as other sort of global shocks hit us, whether it's another pandemic or the climate crisis, how will you make those decisions to keep things on shelves?
So I think we're trying to be innovative too and support partners and others who have been really innovative in their own countries, for example. So one I would call out is in Indiana, sorry to all the Ohioans, but we did work with a really big egg supplier in Indiana to bring Kipster Farms solution for egg farming to the U.S. So in fact, a gentleman from Kipster just emailed me last night and said the first chicks have arrived at Kipster U.S. So that is a carbon neutral, cage-free, zero waste egg farming system that began in the Netherlands. So I had nothing to do with this, by the way. This was our business, our private label business in the Simple Truth team. I think 6 or 7 years ago, started talking with Kipster, and we are bringing it to the U.S. now in partnership with our egg supplier that is helping build the facility and Kipster Farms, and it will be Simple Truth and Kipster cage-free eggs. So please look for that. They will be in, first facility in Indiana. Eggs will come online early 2023. And we are going to have to put the whole weight of Kroger and Simple Truth, et cetera, behind promoting these to customers so they make that choice on shelf. So we are investing in price. We're investing $45 million. We just announced a few months ago, by the way, in our cage-free roadmap. And that includes the work with Kipster, different types of supply contracts, longer-term supply contracts, so that the Kipster team can feel confident about building a facility in Indiana. And also, shelf space, promotions, advertising, all the things to try and get customers there to buy the items. So it's a journey.
Sure.
Some people don't like us to say that, but it is. But we need everyone's help to encourage your friends and family to make those choices when they shop too.
Well, and Kipster is such an interesting story, so it'll be kind of a journey to see how that unfolds and what happens when they make it to the U.S. One of the things I know from knowing you personally, but also professionally, is that collaboration is key. And one of the things that we can end on, I think, is interesting to me, because if you'd asked me, 15 years ago, Denise, if I would be talking to somebody at Kroger like you and I talk, I'd probably say no. Hell no. But I enjoy this kind of collaboration that we have. But one of the things that I've learned, and again, that is interesting to me, is that you're doing all these things that a lot of people don't know about. And one is a human rights assessment that is really the first of its kind by a major retailer. And I'm wondering if you can talk about it.
Yeah, so I personally lead the work on human rights at Kroger, which has been an incredibly fulfilling and such a big learning experience for me. So that's part of the great thing about our jobs, is we get to learn from all of you and learn about all of these topics and really dig into the work. But it was just last year that we started working. We committed to put a human rights due diligence process in place across our global supply chain and in our own operations, by the way. Not just international facilities, but U.S., North America, our own operations. And it's huge. I mean, it's an enormous body of work. I didn't realize when we set the commitment exactly how big it is. But one of the things we've done that we were talking to Danny about is we just completed our first human rights impact assessment in California in mixed greens production, looking at the human rights risks to migrant farm workers. Specifically. We're doing another one soon with another retailer who I don't think I can name yet, but and possibly a third retailer. What we like to do is collaborate too, because Kroger by ourselves cannot fix the issues in our food supply chain. But we are going to do another one soon on farmed shrimp sourced from India. So we are really excited to kind of dig in specifically to these impact assessments. And then the other thing, we work closely, by the way, with Oxfam on that. In fact, we have a meeting with them this week to walk them through the methodology for the farmed shrimp impact assessment and make sure that they're aligned to how we're doing it. And I think the other thing that a lot of people aren't doing is then disclosing and publishing the report. So that is something we've also committed to do in that spirit of openness and transparency. So there are a lot of big issues to tackle if you look across the whole store and all the different products on shelf. but we're trying to dig into a few where there are potentially known risks. We're not starting from zero because there's a large body of knowledge already about what the problems are. What we're trying to do is work more quickly to accelerate solutions and work with partners to do that together.
And again, that collaboration is key. And I wonder what your advice, we have a minute left, to consumers who you already said are sort of overburdened with labels, and now they're experiencing a lot more financial pain, not just the pandemic, but rising food prices. What advice do you have for them?
So I often say, kind of what we spoke to earlier was, in the pandemic we said, first of all, we saw so much like stocking up behavior, we'll call it. Then we said, buy what you need and eat what you buy. So, shop responsibly. But I also say, especially coming out of that, I would say shop in ways that align with your values. So think about what you're buying on shelf. A lot of our customers, by the way, most of our customers overwhelmingly are on a budget, and they are trying to stretch their dollars to feed their families. So they often do buy on price. But where you have choices, try to think a little bit about the stories behind the products on shelf, because there is a lot there. And as we've heard today, there are people everywhere who make the world's food, and we want to make sure that we are taking care and truly, not to go, I didn't intend to go back here, but truly thriving together. And that includes the people who make and transport and sell and then consume the world's food.
Yeah, they need our respect now more than ever. That's a great point to end on. Thank you for your bluntness. Thank you for your collaboration. Really nice to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Before we turn to our next conversation, thank Denise again. Give her another round of applause, please. We have another video to show you, and this time it's from Cristina Rumbaitis del Rio, an international engagement associate with the Food and Land Use Coalition, who is helping to coordinate the Food Systems Pavilion at COP27, which Food Tank is also a part of. So we're really excited to hear from Cristina.
Hi, my name is Cristina Rumbaitis del Rio, and I'm an International Engagement Associate with the Food and Land Use Coalition. And I'm delighted to be working with Food Tank and lots of other organizations in planning the Food Systems Pavilion at COP this year.
I am
the Climate
still
Change
impressed that so many
Conference
people are
in
in this
November
room on a
in
Sunday.
Sharm
So
el-Sheikh,
thank you all for
Egypt.
being here. I'm going to give
This
you
is
a
the
round
first
of
time we're going to
applause.
have a Food Systems
Thank
Pavilion,
you.
which is,
I know you're
is
waiting
really
for the
an
food, but it
opportunity
will
to
be
show
delicious,
how
I
food
promise.
and land use issues
Just
are
give them a
really
few more
central
minutes
to meeting
set up.
climate change objectives.
I'm so glad for today's
Because climate change, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food and agriculture, and yet food and agriculture are so incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, especially for smallholder farmers internationally who are often dependent on rain for their production. We really want to bring to the fore the many issues related to food and land use that touch on climate change, but also really want to highlight the solutions that are available, the technologies, the products, the policies, the choices that consumers can make today that really need to be supported and scaled to meet our ambitious goals with climate change, to keep climate at only 1.5 degrees and no more than that, and to really help farmers across the world adapt to the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing and we're locked into for years to come. So thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited about this opportunity.
Who? Check. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. I know you all are involved in different innovations when it comes to labor. And so I want to give you all the opportunity to speak on what you're working on. If I can start with you, Eric.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm Eric Diamond, CEO of the Central Kitchen. We started our organization 10 years ago as a nonprofit shared incubator space with the thought of getting individuals into entrepreneurship utilizing food. with a very specific passion for minority and women entrepreneurs. Food is kind of a low access to barrier when we're talking about entrepreneurship. So since that time, we've had over 700 companies come through the incubator facility, created over 1,000 jobs in Cleveland. Currently have about 90 members in the incubator, of which 65% are minorities and or women. And another 65% of them came from what I'd call challenged backgrounds, so whether it be poverty or just not access to the capital that kind of their white counterparts have. So we've been very proud of that work that we've been able to do with minority entrepreneurs.
Dr. Newman. Hi. So I'm a rural sociologist here at Ohio State. I'm actually not based in Columbus. I do actually live outside the city in Wayne County. I'm based at the College of Ag's Research Station in Worcester. And my job is both research and extension to look at community and economic development through food and agriculture. And one of the ways that is very easy to measure some of the impacts is through the number of jobs that are created and increasingly the environmental sustainability of these types of initiatives. But what's a lot harder to think about and operationalize is social sustainability. And what does that mean across the food system, especially whether you're in the fields, in the processing sector, in the distribution, in the retail, or the restaurant worker? These are often one of the most dirty jobs that we have in America. They're the least likely to offer benefits and the least likely to offer, and they have the lowest wages. So when 15 to 20 years ago, we really started having this mainstream conversation about creating economic development through food and agriculture, we really need to reconcile with what is a good job in this sector. And so a lot of my work has really focused on how issues like health insurance and childcare affect both economic development and quality of life in the farm sector.
Hi, really happy to be here amongst this amazing group of academics, leaders, thought provokers. I started a nonprofit called Service when the pandemic hit and shut restaurants down. It was really important work for restaurant owners to come together and provide for the people that had brought them to their station in life. We started by providing meals. For the first 8 weeks of the restaurant shutdown, we put out about 11,000 meals. After that, we started handing out grants to people that needed to recover. Since then, so in 2 short years, we have started working with Franklin County and the Board of Commissioners to start a workforce development program in the Franklin County Courthouse. We work with people with all kinds of barriers, some returning citizens, and help them not just overcome barriers, not just train in this workforce, but then we help them with job placement so they have a soft landing as they're growing into this field. We've come to learn that being in the restaurant industry, being in the food industry, we work with some of the highest rates of people with food insecurity. So the onus is on us really to change this system from the bottom up. While the rest of you are trying to figure it out on a global level, some of us can start working on a community level.
Awesome. If I could start with income insecurity, how can we better address income insecurity among food system workers? And what solutions or innovations are you all involved with or have seen?
For us, it's been, the fastest way to get a job is to create one yourself, kind of entrepreneurship, and then taking those barriers away for individuals starting food-based businesses. So we were able to get grants through the USDA, through Gun Foundation, and through PNCE Foundation to provide grants to minorities and women to help them start their businesses, which kind of took that off their plate. And then as we began thinking about it, we do a lot of education. It's all about kind of creating jobs that are well-paying jobs. So if you look at somebody like Cleveland Bagel, who hires a lot of individuals who had been formerly incarcerated, they start off at $20 an hour, and they start off with health care. And Cleveland Kraut, who's probably the largest to come through our organization, they're a $40 million company now, started 6 years ago selling sauerkraut. Their entire workforce is sourced from organizations like Esperanza to bring individuals in and give them chances at better paying jobs. And then one of the programs that we did this past winter was we took 20 inner city students and we took them from January through May, every other week, introducing them to a different part of the food economy, not necessarily like dishwashers, but Nestle's came in, Vitamix came in, and of those 20 students, 12 of them got placed at places like Heinen's, places like Vitamix, places like Rust Belt Riders, which is focusing on food waste. So for us, it's exposing individuals to maybe areas that they didn't have access to before for better paying jobs.
For us, like I said, we're lucky that we got to work or get to work so closely with the public sector. The Franklin County Board of Commissioners had the foresight enough and were open-hearted enough to work us into their budget. So we can provide for better wages for employees coming in. We can provide them with health insurance. We can give them the soft landing so they have time to adjust to this new life without, having things taken away from them right away. One of the things that I think would be really helpful for Ohio is if we turned into a bridge state so that we had a few months to give them that landing before benefits were taken away from them. But besides that, we fight for the rights to get them the wages that they deserve. Of course, that is countered by the fact that we are dealing with inflation in this post-pandemic world. So as much as they're getting these pay raises, they're really kind of negated at this point. But it is about educating. It is about teaching them about financial literacy and, what that dollar is worth in the economy right now. So constant education along with providing them with the support that they need.
So while Sangeeta and Eric work a lot with restaurant workers, I'm working upstream with farmers and looking at that part of the supply chain. And I think what's really interesting is that a lot of times we tend to judge the success or failure of an operator based on their ability to do good production work and their ability to be a good accountant. And we don't often think about the larger social, political, and government policies in which they're embedded in. And I think one thing that's really interesting is if we look at the Census of Agriculture, over half of the nation's farmers don't actually identify their primary occupation as farming. They're actually doing something else. So somebody in the household, either the farmer or their partner, has to have an off-farm job for benefits and to make ends meet and to supplement the household income. So when we're also talking about growing the food economy, we really have to step back and look at what are some of those limitations to not just growing the food economy, but also thinking about implementing different types of environmental practices. When are these types of seminars offered? Who's got the time? Who has the stress? And I think one of the most interesting things doing this research over the last 10 years, traveling around the country and interviewing farmers and doing survey work, is that no matter what you grow or how you grow it, everybody has a family that they love and they want that family to be healthy. And this is an issue that cuts across the food system. So I think also when we're looking at where are the opportunities for collective action, right? Because there's a question about where can I change the world? It's really how can we change the world? And this is, again, an issue that cuts across the food system.
So food system workers are often the most food insecure of us. Can you all talk about how we combat this issue among industry workers and how the public and private sector and even our nonprofits can help contribute to the solutions?
How do you combat it, right? It's multiple steps. It's not one thing. We can't look at any of these things in a vacuum. I mean, healthcare, childcare, transportation, all of those things feed into this insecurity and low wages. So we really have to tackle it from multiple angles at the same time. When you have a worker that's working 2 jobs to make ends meet and then has to run home to try to put a hot meal in front of their family, it's sometimes an impossible task. And I think that's where the food insecurity comes in. Yes, you might have your SNAP benefits and you might have your WIC, but do you have the time or the energy at the end of the day to put that hot meal in front of your family? And I think as a community, we need to do better. We need to subsidize restaurants, maybe micro restaurants in these food desert areas to be able to accept SNAP benefits, right? If I can take a SNAP voucher, my employee doesn't have to go anywhere else to pick up a hot nutrition, a TV ready, I'm sure it looks delicious because now it has a chef's name attached to it. but they get to take it home to their families. And there's a sense of pride in that. You know, you're not just running through McDonald's and putting food in front of your family. You know, so as restaurant owners, as a community, I think those are the things we need to demand a little bit, you know, because it's 2022 and we have food deserts, you know, and that's unacceptable. We need to provide those measures. We need to fill those voids. And that is a person-to-person thing. That doesn't require, you know, an agency coming to take care of it. That's me talking to my local leaders, to my eldermen, and going, help me make this happen. You know, help me put food in front of that family, because this person just worked 80 hours in this week for me, and I can't afford to give them health care benefits because I'm barely surviving this industry. You know, so I think we do need to work together on that.
Do you okay.
I don't have the answer. You know, we try to educate entrepreneurs about, you know, kind of being socially responsible when they're starting their businesses. But it's as we brought these students in over the winter, one of the things that really struck me was we fed them a healthy meal for breakfast and lunch, and the kids loved it. We had it catered by different members of the kitchen. But like the one kid was like, I've never even seen a kiwi in person. Like, I can't get this in my neighborhood. I can get a lot of lottery tickets and cigarettes, but I can't get fresh produce. And so as we started thinking about that, one of the things we were able to do because of our size now is crop planting with farmers. And so one of our companies, Garden of Flavor, they purchase about $500,000 worth of carrots a season. And so we worked with local farmers to have them grow that produce. And I asked the farmer, I said, what happens with the ones that don't make the cut? They're not a certain size or texture. And he says, we'll leave them in the field for fertilizer. And I said, well, you're already bringing that food to our hub. Can we take it? You know, we'll buy it from either organic carrots, pennies on the dollar, you're going to leave them in the fields. And then we processed them and started selling them to local school districts. And so we were able to get organic carrots into 10 school districts last year for the same price that they were paying regular carrots for. And now we've done it with squash and zucchini this year. And we were able to get a grant through the city of Cleveland to expand that program. So it's just, I don't know how necessarily to increase wages all the time, but also getting access to food that's going to be thrown away that we can then support, you know, students in the inner city with that food.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think just talking about these issues is one of the most important things. For a long time, when I started talking about the research we've been doing on health insurance and childcare, and at the conferences, they would stick me in the last session on the last day with nobody coming, right? And all of a sudden, the pandemic happened. It was like, oh, maybe we should be talking a little bit more about these issues. And for a long time, we've taken these, particularly in the farming part of our food supply chain, as the elephant in the room that we never want to talk about. When you try to broach these topics with folks in farm credit, when talking about holistic farm planning, there's no room in there for talking about how are you going to get health insurance and who's going to provide the child care and how is that going to change as you age across your life course. So we really need to have a much more open conversation about that, and I can tell you that farmers are ready to have that. Traveling around the country and hearing farmers cry and say thank you for talking about this to us, because all anybody ever wants to talk to us about is markets. Right, but there's so many more issues that are affecting us. And again, finding that solidarity and those openings are so critical to finding our humanity and our common interests. And it's also really important because there are farmers who are on food stamps, but we don't know that because of the way that we collect our data. Also talking to farm families, many of them are actually forgoing off-farm income because if they did, that would raise their income where they were no longer eligible for CHIP, the state health insurance Medicaid plans that they prioritize having their children covered under health insurance. And when we talk about agriculture, that's the riskiest job, one of the riskiest jobs in the world, right? And to not have health insurance is tragic. And there are a lot of farmers out there who don't get health insurance until they're 65 and eligible for Medicaid. Right? So this is one of the issues of sustainability that we really have to talk about.
Thank you. What are some ways we can transform our food systems for a more equitable distribution of power? Sorry, it's kind of a hard one.
So I'll just start out by saying I think really linking how other national policies that are happening outside of food and agriculture world beyond the Farm Bill are connected to our food and agricultural economy and people is really important, and really trying to break down the silos across departments and having HHS and USDA talking, right, and the Department of Transportation, really having almost like a national level food policy council, right, would really help break down some of those silos. And I think we're increasingly getting there, but there needs to be a lot more work. So maybe Danielle, you can you can take that on. Jen can take that on. But I think that that's really the opportunity to have some transformative changes happen.
I mean, I agree. This conversation happens at a higher level, and by the time it trickles down to, you know, the mom and pop that are working in the restaurant or that are actually going through these struggles, you know, you're talking about years down the line. These are like multi-leveled issues, multi-leveled answers. There's not one answer to any of this. Like, it's multifaceted, and by the time it touches the ground, you know, we're going to be dealing with other problems. So,
yeah, I mean, for us, it's all about, like, I can't change these issues on a you know, a global level, but we can change what's in our backyard. You know, kind of our work, we look at it, we always say you shouldn't have to move to live in a better community. And so providing access and opportunities to entrepreneurs that can then go in and do that social change themselves is kind of what we're all about. We're just kind of an incubator that allows individuals to come in and grow businesses with support. And then they can go on and create these changes. And you look at some of the companies that have come out and the things that they've done around food waste and you know, providing opportunities for individuals that wouldn't have opportunities in this network. For us, it's like that's what we focus on, is our own backyard.
And maybe just to add on really quickly, I feel like I just really have to compliment and champion the Senate Agriculture Committee, because back in March, they held hearings actually on the rural care economy. And I was able to go and provide oral and written testimony about how the rural care economy is affecting, especially childcare. And that, especially as a land grant researcher, to be able to take, because we are funded by all of you, your tax dollars, right? And to be able to take those stories of farmers back to policymakers and have that circle completed was, I think, one of the most rewarding things that we can do as a land grant to really address some of these very sticky, complicated issues. And so I also just want to say thank you to everybody in this room for doing the work that you do, because this is part of the solution in bringing up those issues.
So we're running out of time, but do I have time for one more question? Sure, quick. Okay. So to kind of sum it all up, how do we build a more socially just food supply chain for our workers?
So a great example, I think, just comes from Wisconsin Farmers Union, where there is a solidarity across the supply chain movement, where it's finding the collective we and not the I.
I love that.
How do you top that?
That is the
we're
answer.
done.
Drop the mic right there.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great panel. Thank you all so much for being here and for the incredible work that you all do. I need everyone to take a moment, because before our last fireside chat, I need you to think good thoughts that our next video will work. So just take a moment, because it's a really cool one too, and I hope we can hear the sound. But it's a trailer for Food 2050, which is a documentary film series, and it will end up being a big documentary from the Rockefeller Foundation and Media Red that follows the efforts of 10 global visionaries improving the world's food systems from the ground up. So please play.
Millones de personas mueren por consumir agua no apta para el consumo humano.
作为一个国家，可能我们有14亿人口，但是有3亿人是有这个心血管疾病啊，或者有这个三高啊。
Without the intimacy of human connection to the planet, we're really looking for trouble.
We have a food system that's actually killing us.
moment you make contact with nature, you think differently.
当我在看到这些植物的时候，它们已经不仅仅是一个修饰或者是一个茄子。
By 2050, I envision a nation who are proud to feed and sustain their families.
The future is in the hands of the people. The question is, are you going to be a part of it, or will you sit back and watch it happen?
I've seen that video multiple times now, and I do get chills every time I see it. Food Tank will be working with the Rockefeller Foundation and Media Red to host screenings of it. So please check out foodtank.com for more information as the documentary finishes up. Now it is my true honor to introduce our speakers for the final conversation of the day. I get to welcome back Matthew Rand, who's an incredible journalist, who will be speaking with the incredible Dr. Rattan. I will finish introducing him. Sorry, Matthew, I keep come on up. He's a distinguished university professor of soil science and the director of the Carbon Management and Sequestration Center at OSU. He's also the recipient, as we heard before, of the 2020 World Food Prize. He has made soil a religion in such a positive and incredible way, and I truly, truly am honored to, whenever I'm in his presence, which has been more than a few times now, lucky me, it's such an honor, so enjoy.
Thank you.
I'm in the presence of a rock star, it sounds like. Why don't you give us, before we get into all this, sort of your background and how you wound up studying soil?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Jill Clark and Danny and you, talk to you also on the Zoom, to be here. It's really a great honor. I learned quite a lot. Danny, anytime I hear you, I learn something new. Really appreciate. I grew up on a farm in Punjab, India, and being a farmer and a small farmer, which is a majority of the farmers of the world, soil becomes a very basic natural resource to be managed. And I had an interest in that resource from the very beginning.
What is soil? I think probably people don't spend a lot of their time thinking about what soil is, what it's made out of, but you do. What are we talking about?
Well, interestingly enough, somebody asked me the other day, we were exercising together, and said, what do you do? I said, I teach soil and climate. You teach what? I said, soil. Is that the same thing as dirt? No, it's not. Dirt kills life. Soil gives and supports life. There's a big difference between the two. And that is what I think I very much like what Dan Glickman had to say. Sometimes we give soil and agriculture not the due respect they deserve. And that's a part of the problem.
It's safe to say soil is alive?
Soil is absolutely alive. 1/3 of all terrestrial biodiversity lives in soil. And if soil was not supporting life, it would be very impossible to support ecosystem services that are essential. So maybe a step further, soil being an alive thing shouldn't, like any other living thing, that also has a rights. Rights to be protected, rights to thrive, rights to manage properly, and right not to be treated like dirt. Absolutely.
That's fair. Starting in the 1970s, my understanding, you looked at this issue of soil erosion and degradation in sub-Saharan Africa. Can you talk about that, what you found there when you looked at the soil there?
I was really very privileged, fortunate. I got a job at the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. It was funded at that time by Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, by USAID, by a few other Canadian, CEDA,
and few other. It was not a part of the CGIAR system. And one thing that I was not prepared to even think about doing, the forest was being cleared. Tropical rainforest was cleared by bulldozers, and plowed, of course, was absolutely necessary. The farmers were doing that plowing. The land was plowed after clearing. We were waiting for the Board of Trustees meeting. We all prepared our plots, plowed beautifully clean seed bed. And the evening before came a torrential downpour, about 4 inches of rain falling at the rate of about 6 inches per hour intensity. And I knew what might have happened. I ran to my plots very first thing in the morning, and the plots were not there. I went back to the board of office of the research to tell my director, do not bring the board of trustees there. There's nothing to show. And this is where I realized one plowing on a very erodible soil, even on a gentle slope, what havoc it can do. And this is where the lesson was, perhaps we can do without plowing.
And my mind goes to countries like Haiti, which I know has a long history of soil erosion. It's a finite resource, really.
Soil is a finite resource, very precious resource, very unequally distributed resource, something that takes a long time to generate. 1 inch of soil may take thousands and thousands of years to generate, and sometimes we can lose that in one rainfall. So countries like Haiti, in fact, you fly over the island, you can see where the borderline is, and that's exactly what happens when soil is not respected.
How did you first begin to answer this question of how to better preserve, protect, and promote, if you'll forgive the alliteration, the soil we walk under?
Well, that experience in Nigeria was really, and not only did that rainfall destroy that experimental plots, but few days after that, the plots which were survived, they were wilting. So here was a situation, a serious flood caused by improper land use and improper soil management. Then a few days after that, the same place had a serious drought. So the drought flood syndrome, which happens everywhere in the world, right now very serious in South Asia, is really the two sides of the same coin. And the coin happened to be mismanagement of the soil. One place or the other, one way or the other. Somebody made a comment just a few minutes ago, it's not important what you grow. The most important part is how you grow it.
And I'm not a farmer, but you are. And you can talk about, there seems like a myriad number of ways that farmers have tried to answer this question of how better to promote crop yields and plant growth that we rely on for food. And a lot of those are sort of external, above ground methods, but you looked below the surface. How did you figure that out?
Well, first of all, I must say that the farmers are really the greatest steward of natural resources. And we must give them a due respect. Our policies must be pro-nature, pro-agriculture, and pro-farmer. Dan Glickman was very right. You know, we must really pay more emphasis on it. And from that point of view, while I'm talking about that, I must mention, in case of respect, sometimes you ask, what does you want your son to be? And it will be not saying they should study agriculture. They want them to be doctor, they want them to be IT person, they want to be anchor, absolutely very important.
Trust
but
me,
it never occurred to them that they want to
more
be
money in other lines of work. But
they don't want them to be soil scientists or agriculture. And that is our societal values. And we don't value what farmers and what agriculture and what soil does. And that requires education. that require change of behavior, that require some kind of communication at all level, especially to the parents.
I want to get into the science a little bit, and a lot of your work has to do with carbon, and we think of carbon as the main building block for life as we know it, right? But how does carbon in soil impact the plants we grow for food?
Well, you know, one thing which we do not realize when we talk about climate change, we always think fossil fuel, which is really a major culprit. But until 1920s and 1930s, more carbon greenhouse gas emission came from agriculture, land use change, than from fossil fuel. Right now it's 10 gigaton versus 1 gigaton from land use and conversion. So over the 10,000 years of agriculture history globally, we have lost approximately 600 gigaton of carbon from forest and soil and wetlands by conversion to agricultural practices. And soil alone, agricultural soil alone, have probably lost as much as 150, 140 gigaton of carbon. And carbon is the basic ingredient of the soil health. If there was one thing which I could pinpoint, that would be soil organic carbon content. And somehow we have to think about recarbonization. The question was being raised, can we really keep the global warming to 2 degrees centigrade, 1.5 degrees centigrade? The answer to that question is yes. Two things have to happen. Find alternative to fossil fuel, and I think Ohio being a coal economy, that's really not a very popular statement going to be, but we have to do that. Find alternative to fossil fuel, the sooner the better, and recarbonize the biosphere that we have lost. If we implement those things through respect to farming profession, through paying farmers for what they deserve, for ecosystem services that we create, it can still be done.
You were talking about so carbon sequestration, right? And that's something we're used to talking about and thinking about in terms of fighting climate change, but this also has a benefit when it comes to improving our food situation.
Absolutely. When we put the carbon back in the soil, that the carbon sequestration through plants. So what plants do is every year on an annual basis, 123 gigaton of carbon plants take from the atmosphere and grow by the process of photosynthesis. Unfortunately, most of it goes back. Half of it goes back by plant respiration, 60 goes back to soil and soil respiration, some goes back by erosion and other processes. So if some of that carbon can be put back through sequestration, as we are talking about, I think we can mitigate climate change. But at the same time, the other question that came up today was, we are very calorie-centric. We are not nutrition-centric. We are not natural resource-centric. So putting carbon back will address those questions, the quality of the food. And I think that point which came up was health and human health. There is a concept I call One Health concept. And One Health concept means health of soil, plants, animal, people, environment, and the planet is one and indivisible. We talk about medical profession. We talk about medicine. Food is the medicine. And healthy food comes from healthy soil. 17 micronutrients required for a healthy diet have to come from healthy soil. And that is a part which we must make sure that everybody understands.
Give us a sense of, across the globe, the scale of the land degradation issue. Obviously, we talked about not all soil being created equal and in the same amounts. How big is this problem?
Our colleague from FAO, she was the opening speaker, their data, 1/3 of all land is degraded. 1/3. Approximate estimate is somewhere between 2 to 3 billion hectares. 2 billion was the figure in the 1990s estimate. That came from Zurich in Holland. 10 million hectares probably being degraded annually by erosion, by salinization, especially of the irrigated land, by mining nutrients, extractive farming practices, by mining organic carbon as a source of nutrients, by not returning what we take from land back to the land. And so soil degradation is really one of the greatest issue, and soil degradation also leads to global warming. They are mutually enhancing processes. More degradation causes more global warming, and more global warming causes more degradation. Therefore, this vicious cycle should be broken, and the person who that can break it is the farmer.
Talk to me, if you would, about conservation agriculture, and there's a sort of a spectrum of things that we can do to improve the quality and the sustainability of our soil. What does that look like?
Panelist just a few minutes ago, she introduced herself from Worcester. At Worcester, Ohio, since 1960, along with 3 other sites, experiments were set up at that time on no-till agriculture without plowing. And nowadays we call it conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture has 3, 4, 5 pillars. No tillage, no plowing. Keep the crop residue back in the land. Grain for people, residue for soil. That's the equity we must maintain. Soil produces it, put something back. Complex rotations. Not continuous monoculture, but complex crop. Integration of crops with trees and livestock. Integrated nutrient management. All that together is called conservation agriculture. Right now we have about 200 million hectares under conservation agriculture, out of 1.5 billion hectares under cropland. So we have a long way to go.
Are the major players looking at this and adopting this, or do you see that?
U.S. is one of the good players. Dan Glickman mentioned that, and I think we should be proud of it, but not as good as Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, those South American, Brazil especially. They do very properly. We have a rotational no-till. One year we do no-till, next we do chisel-till. That's not the same thing. We need to do continuous no-till. Some of our farmers do. Quite a few farmers in Ohio do that. I'm very proud of them, but we got a long way to go. And one of the way we can encourage them to do that is payment for ecosystem services. Rather than subsidies, I think if we were to compensate farmer for carbon sequestration at a fair price, and the fair price to me is $130 per ton of carbon, which means $30 to $35 per carbon credit. Credit is 1 ton of CO2. Some companies are paying $6, $8, and I salute them, but undervaluing a very precious resource such as carbon is causing the tragedy of the commons. You mentioned about soil degradation. That's what happened. So if we can pay farmers the right price, they will do it.
I want to take us back to sub-Saharan Africa and where you kind of started your career, right? And have things improved in all from an agricultural standpoint? Where do you see things going?
I am very sad in a way. When I joined there in '69, the cereal crop yield on a continental scale, that is corn, sorghum, millet, upland rice, and so forth, 1 ton per hectare. 50 years after, 60 years after almost, the yield is on a continental level still about 1.5, 1.25. The green revolution that saved hundreds of millions of people from starvation in South Asia, Central America, I'll say, bypassed Africa. And it still has not happened. It has not happened because we have not paid attention to the soil health. We talk about irrigation. Only 6% of the land area in irrigated cropland area and irrigable cropland is being irrigated, 6%, compared to 40% in Asia. The fertilizer used in Africa is 17 kilogram per hectare, compared with 135 global average, compared than 250 kilogram per hectare in Punjab, where I come from, compared to 400 kilogram per hectare in northeastern China plain. We take away from soil and we don't return it. There's a law of return. Whatever you take from land, you must put it back at the same place. In Africa, that has not happened. And the policy is one issue. The science is one. We know the science. I knew that science when that erosion problem happens. Next year, we planted no-till, cover crop, all that we control. Translating that science into action requires political willpower.
And as we look at, these growing issues of population growth, of climate change, how do we make the food systems we have more resilient to these changes? Any predictions for the next 20, 30 years?
Well, first of all, I must go back to the debate we had today that we are producing enough food globally. There's no question about that. We are producing 3 billion tons of grains. Unfortunately, as somebody said, 1 billion ton of grains reach no stomach, human or animal. They are wasted. And my colleague from Kroger, I do want to make this statement. Food waste, I think, I'm not quite sure whether how much impact it has, but this idea of buy one, get one free bread, pardon me, Kroger, I was wondering if we could sell things at half price.
It's a thought.
And it may save. I think the problem is access to food, the problem is food waste, problem is poverty, problem is civil strife, problem is political instability. Look what has happened in Ukraine. 10 million more refugees. We already had 70 million. We got 10 million more. And Ukraine was providing fertilizers and wheat and all those things, disruption. So it is the social, political, human dimension issues.
Sure.
And that require really to pay attention to address this issue.
Thank you. And in just the moments we have left, your thought, what gives you hope, I should say, for the future?
I am very optimistic. I think through education, through paying respect to the farming profession at all levels, to making sure that education of the agricultural natural resources is done properly, to make sure that our curricula, even at kindergarten level, does anybody know of any alphabet book which is oriented toward environment? None. And I think that is where we have to catch the attention of the brightest and the best right at that age, primary school, to make sure they understand where the food comes from. Will it happen? Yes, I'm sure it will. And I think the meeting like what we're having today, what J.L. Clark and Donnie and you have done, that's a good start.
Doctor, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
What an incredible conversation. Keep it up for Dr. Lal and Matthew, please. Thank you, sir. This has been an incredible day full of great speakers and moderators and all of you who have stuck around. This has been a full room for hours on a Sunday. I can't tell you how happy I am. Thank you so much for honoring World Food Day with us. It is a day to respect and recognize those who work in food and agriculture systems in all its forms. Farmers, food workers, all of you working in advocacy in different ways. And it's a time to recognize that we have a lot to do, so we have to get busy. And I hope that you will all take this conversation and the questions that you still have forward. Use that hashtag World Food Day. Keep asking questions. Keep criticizing and critiquing. Please share your thoughts and what you're doing in your own communities. I just want to thank our partners, and then I'll let you get to the food. OSU has been an incredible partner. They've just been amazing. The Ohio Food Policy Network, again, amazing. FAO North America, I can't thank them enough. I especially want to thank Jill Clark, Elaine McLaughlin, and Amy Velasquez for all of their help developing today's program. I want to thank WOSU-NPR, especially John Prosek and Alexis Perrone for hosting us and streaming this summit and making it available across the country and across the world. I want to thank our amazing volunteers, Fiona Evans, Kyle Knott, Madison Kate, Cameron Wrights, and Aiden Irish. And thank you to the entire Food Tank team, including my co-founder, Bernard Pollock, and our our content director, Elena Seeley. They are incredible. And I want to give my final thanks to the OSU Dining Services for preparing these delicious dishes. There's an open bar right to your right when you go out. So have fun, stick around, meet the speakers. Thank you all again.